The young prince stands inside an extravagantly furnished hall, maintaining a courteous yet resolute expression as a maid presents him with a tray of food. He turns her away, saying he has no appetite and asking to be left alone, clearly preoccupied with other thoughts. Beyond the palace, the moon hangs high above a dark and silent forest, a harsh contrast to the luxurious existence he has just recalled. Once, his royal position granted him access to the finest delicacies imaginable, but his life has since changed dramatically. Now he crouches beside a small campfire, his face twisted with pain as he forces himself to swallow a chunk of raw, dark monster flesh. Its taste is revolting, almost impossible to endure, yet he knows that eating it is his only way to survive in the wilderness. His desperate struggle began after he escaped the protection of the castle and entered the wild, where he started hunting the very monsters roaming the forest. Nearby lies the corpse of a horned creature, a grim reminder of the scavenger's life he has been forced to adopt. Remembering the magnificent feasts of the castle leaves a bitter taste. The tables may have been overflowing with food, but every meal carried the possibility of death. Only too late did he discover that the royal dishes were being contaminated with slow-acting poisons, transforming his palace home into a gilded prison. The man responsible for this betrayal is Prime Minister Gamales, whose cruel smirk remains fixed in the prince's memory. With corruption consuming the kingdom and a tyrant determined to have him killed, the young prince wonders how much longer he can endure such a miserable existence. Even so, his determination to survive has not been broken. Without warning, a towering woman steps out from the shadows of the forest, her wild and commanding presence striking beneath the moonlight. Looking down at the struggling young man, she makes an astonishing declaration. He will become her pupil. She had appeared so suddenly and concealed her presence so completely that he had failed to notice her until she was already standing before him. Tightening his grip around his sword, he stares at her in shock, wondering who this intimidating woman could be. Still shaken by her abrupt appearance, he asks why she would consider him worthy of inheriting her swordsmanship. The two face one another in the moonlit clearing, her enormous weapon standing as a silent testament to her strength. With a sharp, knowing smirk, she explains that there is one gruesome reason she considers him worthy. He is eating monster meat. The prince can barely believe what he has heard. Blinking in confusion, he asks her to repeat such a ridiculous explanation. Later, seated together beside the flickering warmth of the campfire, she explains the grim truth behind his unusual diet. Monster flesh tastes horrible and is naturally poisonous, but any human capable of enduring it will gradually begin absorbing the strength of the creatures they consume. He admits that adapting to it was anything but easy, remembering how he vomited during his first attempts. Still, he remarks with grim irony that monster meat is less deadly than the food served inside the palace, the same poison meals that had already killed the royal poison tester. As the flames crackle beside them, he reveals more of his tragic past. The struggle for succession had transformed his own home into a deadly trap. With his mother gone and his father unwilling to protect him, he became an obvious target for assassination and was eventually forced to flee because every piece of food placed before him had been laced with poison. Watching Cassandra, he notices that his story does not move her at all. She offers him no sympathy for what he has suffered. He does not care. He has long since grown accustomed to the world's cold indifference, and although the monster meat tastes like filth, it remains the only thing allowing him to stay alive while becoming stronger. Noticing that some hesitation still remains within him, she reaches out and offers him a gift. She warns that if poison still frightens him, then he is nowhere near prepared for the road ahead. Her unexpected generosity catches him off guard, and he asks why a complete stranger would go so far for his sake. At that moment, she finally introduces herself, simply telling him that her name is Cassandra. She stands before him with a calm, almost uninterested expression while the significance of her name sinks in. The young man can scarcely believe what he has heard, repeating the title, Red Demon's Sword Saint Cassandra, with equal parts disbelief and awe. She confirms that people do call her that, although she admits she has never particularly liked the nickname Red Demon. He stares at her as stories of the legendary saint race through his mind, a warrior famous for killing dragons and even evil gods. Realizing that someone so overwhelmingly powerful has accepted him as a student fills him with an immediate sense of safety. With Cassandra protecting him, the assassins hunting him suddenly seem insignificant. His gaze then falls upon a small, dark ring resting in his hand. Far from being ordinary jewelry, it is a cursed object created to continuously expose whoever wears it to an extremely powerful and debilitating poison. With a piercing look, Cassandra gives him his first order, declaring it the opening trial of his apprenticeship. His task is to overcome the poison radiating from the ring, a command that leaves him briefly frozen in disbelief as he stares at the cursed object. The reaction comes immediately and with devastating force. He crumples to the ground, struggling for breath while the poison ravages his body. Agony races through every nerve, and as he clutches his chest, the horrifying horrifying thought flashes through his mind that his life may end right there on the cold floor. As he writhes in agony, Cassandra explains the ruthless reasoning behind the exercise. Resistance to poison can only be developed by confronting the toxin directly. She points out that an ordinary person would have died instantly, but his long history of eating monster meat may have given him just enough resistance to survive. Even so, he cannot shake the feeling that he has placed his fate in the hands of someone genuinely dangerous. The scene moves to the royal chambers, where the king and the court physician stand in grim silence. The doctor confesses that he has completely failed, explaining that neither conventional medicine nor even the most powerful healing magic can affect the mysterious illness destroying the prince's body. For 3 agonizing days and nights, the young prince hangs between life and death, pale and drenched in sweat against his pillows. As the physicians lose all hope and rumors of his imminent death spread throughout the castle, he somehow continues to endure, eventually finding enough strength to pull himself back from the edge of the abyss. After recovering enough to stand again, he begins viewing the royal court with a newly sharpened cynicism. Plenty of people offer empty congratulations on his survival, yet he notices something chilling. Not one person asks how he was poisoned or who might have been responsible. The silence only confirms that constant vigilance is essential inside this nest of vipers. Instead of receiving comfort from his father, his recovery earns him a cold reprimand from the king. Seated on the throne, the monarch brushes the entire incident aside and tells his son that protecting himself is solely his own responsibility, forcing the young prince to confront just how completely indifferent his family is toward him. Sitting before another meal, he studies a large loaf of bread with intense suspicion. Having only recently survived the deadly toxin from the cursed ring, he cannot stop himself from wondering whether even this ordinary food has been poisoned as another test. He cautiously takes a bite of the meat and waits for the familiar burning agony, wondering whether the sharp intensity of the flavor signals another hidden toxin. To his enormous relief, he realizes that it is merely the taste of exceptionally good food, its flavor seeming even more vivid now that his body has developed resistance to weaker poisons. Filled with pride over what he has accomplished, the young prince bows deeply before his master and sincerely thanks her for methods that, while brutal, have proven effective. He proudly announces that he has finally overcome the lethal poison of the ring, and Cassandra responds with a satisfied, knowing smirk. Yet she already has his next lesson waiting. Cassandra drops 2 heavy metal bracelets onto the ground, their weight smashing craters into the stone beneath them. She explains that gravity magic has been placed on them to double the weight of his body, making him realize with a cold sweat that her training is intentionally designed to drive him right to the edge of death. Later, while the two stand in the thick forest, she asks whether he has continued following his strict monster meat diet. When he admits that he stopped eating it a week earlier because the ring's poison no longer frightens him, her expression immediately hardens. She warns him that allowing his conditioning to slip like that is completely unacceptable. Before long, they discover the enormous, blood-covered corpse of a great basilisk lying among the trees. Cassandra tells him to remain where he is while she prepares the next part of his merciless nutritional training. Displaying her terrifying strength as though it were nothing, she slices an enormous slab of flesh from the creature and launches it high into the air. She catches the massive piece of meat effortlessly with one hand before presenting it to him, explaining that it is the rare flesh of a great basilisk. Cassandra orders him to eat it immediately, leaving no room whatsoever for protest. She explains that although the meat is raw and extraordinarily potent, surviving the cursed ring's poison has transformed his body enough to process something this dangerous. According to her, consuming it is the only way for him to continue increasing his strength. He cautiously asks whether he could at least cook the bloody slab first to make it easier to eat, but Cassandra rejects the idea outright, insisting that heat would destroy the essential nutrients his body requires. With no alternative, he resigns himself to the ordeal and begins tearing into the raw, grisly flesh, gagging as he forces each bite down beneath her relentless, watchful gaze. His body immediately rebels against the basilisk meat, its raw and fibrous texture triggering violent retching. Even with bile rising into his throat, Cassandra's order to swallow remains absolute, forcing him to push the toxic nourishment down. His eyes widen from the effort as tears brought on by sheer physical revulsion stream across his face, one hand gripping his throat. His master watches from across from him with an icy, unwavering stare, showing absolutely no compassion for his suffering. Between desperate gasps and repeated bouts of gagging, he manages to ask just how lethal the meat actually is. Then he drops to his knees, the overwhelming toxicity of the meal causing his entire nervous system to scream in protest. Cassandra confirms his fears with unsettling calm, explaining that the stronger a monster becomes, the more deadly its natural toxins tend to be. To her, that danger is not a reason to avoid the meat, but an essential part of the brutal process meant to transform him. After an exhausting struggle, he finally manages to keep the flesh in his stomach, though the reality of what he has just consumed sends a chill through him. Even a small taste from such a creature could kill hundreds of ordinary men, yet he is being made to eat it by a woman whose training methods seem dangerously close to madness. Any sense of relief disappears when Cassandra points toward an enormous mound of the same dark, uncooked flesh. She challenges his determination, asking whether he truly thinks he can afford to reject the very food necessary for surpassing his present limits. Finally pushed beyond endurance by her endless demands, the young swordsman draws his weapon and resolves to attack with every last ounce of strength he has left. His frustration only grows when he notices that she does not even bother reaching for her own sword, treating his desperate challenge as little more than an inconvenience. Letting out a defiant shout, he charges forward and swings his blade in a desperate arc. Cassandra responds with effortless fluidity, deflecting the attack and throwing him to the ground before his mind can even process how she moved. Beaten and humiliated, he finds himself lying on the ground once again, openly crying as he returns to the miserable task of eating. Standing above him, Cassandra coldly reminds him that his own weakness is the only reason such an unforgiving training regimen is necessary. The following days dissolve into an exhausting routine of devouring monster flesh and enduring relentless sword training under her constant supervision. Despite the enormous amount of toxic meat he consumes, Cassandra remains unimpressed, questioning his dedication when she sees that his physical development is not matching the legendary strength contained within his diet. He remembers how his training eventually evolved beyond ordinary exercises into a vicious cycle of hunting monsters and eating their flesh. Whenever he tried to avoid the disgusting meat, Cassandra would force it down his throat, while even the slightest lapse in concentration during sword practice earned him a merciless beating. Because of this, she began choosing monsters specifically powerful enough to drive him to his absolute limit, ensuring that every victory came only by the narrowest margin. Time and again, he would collapse beside the corpse of a beast he had just killed, fully aware that his master never intended to let him fight anything that was not potentially lethal. When they face each other in training once again, Cassandra provokes him further. She acknowledges that he has improved, but demands that he attack her with genuine killing intent. Looking at her, he comes to a chilling realization. Of every terrifying monster he has encountered, the woman standing before him is unquestionably the most dangerous of them all. Their clash becomes an indistinct blur of violence, her movements so impossibly fast that his body can barely react in time. Cassandra possesses the frightening skill to restrain herself just enough to avoid killing him, yet every training session still leaves him battered and destroyed, repeatedly hovering at death's edge throughout 3 long and hellish years. One of her strikes crashes into him with enough force to feel as though it could shatter bone. Even through the pain, however, he begins finding his rhythm, a faint but determined smile appearing as he successfully predicts her next attack. Cassandra notices immediately and comments on his growing skill, while he silently attributes the improvement to survival instincts sharpened over years of suffering, allowing him to sense an opponent's presence and avoid incoming strikes. Their sparring suddenly comes to an end when an enormous winged wyvern descends into the clearing, its roar booming around them. Instead of stepping in to help, Cassandra simply moves aside, sheathes her weapon, and casually informs him that dealing with the creature is now his responsibility. Adrenaline surging through him, he rushes the beast, driving his blade through its thick hide as the wyvern attempts to crush him beneath its weight. Eventually, the creature crashes to the ground in a massive heap of scales and stone, killed by the young warrior's relentless attacks. Cassandra watches with a rare hint of approval and admits that although a wyvern cannot be compared to a true dragon, it is still a powerful enemy, and he has at last become genuinely strong. Later, holding a piece of the creature's heart in his hands, he offers a dry and exhausted word of thanks for the meal, remarking that starvation is his only alternative. Cassandra immediately notices the bitterness in his tone, narrowing her eyes as she demands that he repeat the insolent comment. Reflecting on the brutal routine he has endured, he agrees with Cassandra that his body has finally adapted to consuming monster flesh. While she observes his progress with a knowing smirk, he privately thinks that facing an entire army of assassins would almost feel merciful compared with the relentless severity of her training. Then Cassandra's expression unexpectedly softens into a rare smile of satisfaction as she delivers a shocking declaration. There is nothing more she can teach him. The young warrior freezes, staring at her in stunned silence as the meaning of her words settles over him and his years of training abruptly come to an end. He remains rooted in place as Cassandra turns away, her figure slowly disappearing into the moonlit forest after delivering one final and chilling warning. She promises that if they ever meet again and she finds that his skills have deteriorated, she will kill him. With that ultimatum, the woman who spent years forging him into a weapon vanishes into the darkness, leaving only the fading traces of her departure behind. He continues staring down the empty path, realizing just how little he ever truly learned about the wandering woman who remained beside him for 3 years. Despite the constant danger of her sword and the mystery surrounding her origins, he He feels an overwhelming gratitude toward her for forcing him to discover a level of strength within himself that he might never have found alone. His strength had been forged in the deepest depths of despair. Born from the fragile thread he clung to while escaping both the literal and figurative pits of hell. Every agonizing meal and every collision of blades carried him farther from the helpless victim he had once been and closer to the survivor this brutal ordeal had shaped him into. The road ahead is now unmistakably clear. He must overcome both the monstrous dangers roaming the wilderness and the political assassins dispatched by the treacherous Gamales. If he intends to survive this world and the eventual return of his master, he knows he must keep pushing himself beyond the limits of ordinary human endurance. With grim determination, he bites into another piece of raw flesh, accepting the disgusting price demanded by his continued evolution. There is no path backward. If he wants to reclaim his life and secure his future, consuming monsters remains his only means of salvation. Mars intercepts yet another assassin, his sword crashing against the attacker's steel. Some time has passed since Cassandra, his teacher, disappeared, and without her presence, Gamaras's attempts to kill him have become relentless. With exhausted amusement, Mars notes that this is already the 10th assassin sent after him this month, and jokingly wonders whether the assassination business is suffering from a labor shortage. The source of the bloodshed lies within a complicated struggle over succession. Gamaras forced Mars's father into marriage in order to establish a claim to the throne, and now Gamaras's daughter intends to remove everyone who might threaten her inheritance, including Mars and his brother Nickel. His thoughts return to Cassandra, the Red Demon, and the merciless lessons she once imposed upon him. He remembers her standing over him with monster flesh in hand, threatening to kill him if he ever allowed himself to become lazy. Even now, he still cannot understand how someone so terrifying ever ended up becoming his mentor. Pulling the corpse of a slain monster through the snow, Mars reflects on the bizarre direction his life has taken. If he wants to survive the schemes unfolding within the royal court, he understands that becoming stronger is no longer optional. He throws himself into relentless training, despite knowing that after such a prolonged era of peace, swordsmanship has largely come to be regarded as a primitive remnant of a more barbaric age. Genuine battlefield skills have almost completely disappeared throughout the kingdom of Fallon. Hidden from sight, Cassandra observes his development, recognizing that although anyone obsessed with the sword is often dismissed as insane, this particular young prince may eventually prove useful to her. Unaware of her distant observation, Mars approaches a group of soldiers and asks permission to participate in their training. The response is immediately hostile, with the men assuming he is merely a spoiled aristocrat looking to amuse himself at their expense. Eventually, one soldier notices something different in the determination burning behind the young man's eyes and gives in. He allows Mars to train alongside them, although his voice remains rough and distinctly unwelcoming. Before they begin, the soldier delivers one final and potentially deadly warning. Mars is not to complain if their training ends up killing him. Mars merely looks back at him, privately deciding that the man is nothing but a fool. A moment later, Mars grunts as a devastating impact sends him sliding across the dirt, the force powerful enough to break an ordinary man apart. Commander Agma watches with genuine surprise, remarking that the same blow would normally leave an assassin split into two, yet the young prince simply brushes the dirt from his clothing. Grinning defiantly, Mars calls out to the others, completely unfazed by the brutal demonstration of strength. Facing the assembled unit, Mars states his conditions plainly. Every 7 days, the soldiers will act as his training partners. Beneath the moonlight, the exhausted men exchange uneasy looks as they absorb the demand coming from the very nobleman they had previously treated with contempt. One soldier immediately objects, arguing that they cannot waste time playing training games when simply finding enough food each day is already difficult. Mars responds without hesitation, reminding them that he is stronger than all 5 of them combined, which makes this training something they cannot afford to dismiss. The soldier then presses him for an explanation, asking what luxurious royal foods could possibly have given him such extraordinary physical strength, naturally assuming that a noble's meals must be vastly superior to theirs. Mars casually answers that his power comes from eating red-boned meat, immediately causing the image of an enormous horned monster to flash through their minds. The soldier's expression twists with equal parts anger and disbelief as he shouts that no single warrior could possibly accomplish such a thing. He insists that red-boned flesh is essentially poison and refuses to accept that a nobleman could survive eating a monster that normally requires an entire group of hunters to bring down. The others quickly join in, with one man recalling how he nearly died after eating nothing more dangerous than a killer rabbit. They stare at Mars as though he has lost his mind, convinced that he is inventing an absurd story to frighten them and conceal the real reason behind his strength. Mars ignores their ridicule and simply points toward the darkness behind them, calmly observing that their ignorance is precisely what makes them weak. The soldiers instantly fall silent as an enormous shadow begins rising behind behind them, stretching a long and terrifying silhouette across the group. Panic breaks out the moment they recognize the immense outline of a blood bear, its roar thundering through the surrounding trees. While the soldiers scramble in fear, Mars remains completely motionless, narrowing his eyes as he studies the monster not as an immediate danger, but as tomorrow's potential meal. Before the blood bear could even complete its roar, its enormous head was cut clean from its body in a burst of movement too fast for the soldiers to follow. They remained frozen in place, staring at the decapitated apex predator as they struggled to comprehend how effortlessly it had been killed. Mars, meanwhile, sat calmly among the remains and casually began eating a piece of the prepared flesh. With a slight shrug, he offered some to the stunned soldiers, demonstrating that what they regarded as deadly poison was, for him, simply another source of fuel for his increasing strength. Holding out a piece of dark, uncooked meat toward one of the reluctant soldiers, Mars gives him a strict warning. He is allowed only a single small bite because attempting to eat the entire portion would result in certain death. Hesitantly, the soldier bites into the flesh, his expression twisting with fear and revulsion as he experiences the taste of the forbidden meat for himself. His body reacts immediately and violently. He bends forward, gripping his throat as the toxins overwhelm him, the sound of his retching carrying through the clearing. The brutal scene and Mars's uncompromising approach to training recall the origins of the group itself. Their original leader had once been the son of a nobleman who felt suffocated by the expectations of high society and wanted a life measured by strength rather than manners. Gathering others who shared that belief, he founded the 100, an organization devoted entirely to achieving absolute power. The group follows a rigid hierarchy in which physical strength is the only measure that matters. The position known as number 1 belongs exclusively to the strongest warrior among them, a rank they had always considered the highest level of martial ability in the kingdom, far beyond the ceremonial knights of the capital. Now, however, they have encountered someone whose power exists completely outside that established order. The soldier's screams of pain fill the clearing, yet Mars shows no reaction. He looks down at the suffering man with cold, unwavering eyes and orders him to continue eating the monster flesh regardless of what it is doing to his body. Mars explains that this ordeal is only the first stage of a much harsher process. Before they can even dream of surviving blood bear meat, their bodies must first become accustomed to the weaker flesh of killer rabbits. If they lack the determination to endure something like this, then all their talk about pursuing strength is meaningless. Faced with Mars's overwhelming power and unwavering resolve, the warriors of the 100 fall to their knees in complete submission. They beg him to guide them, formally asking him to become their leader and granting him a title that stands above every existing rank within their organization. Their commander proposes the title number 0 as a deliberate strategic choice. It allows Mars to function without exposing his royal identity, concealing his true name while simultaneously recognizing him as a power superior to everyone else in the hierarchy. To protect his identity even further, Mars begins wearing a set of ancient armor recovered from forgotten ruins. Hidden behind this disguise, he can train beside the warriors and fight at full strength without holding anything back, a decision that allows both his combat ability and his leadership to rise to unprecedented levels. Mars reflects on the extraordinary persistence of the men under his command. No matter how many times he defeats members of the 100, they refuse to surrender, repeatedly throwing themselves back into battle with a determination that exceeds even that of the hardened assassins who once hunted him. They continue pushing until their bodies physically collapse, driven by an enthusiasm bordering on obsession. As the seasons change and an entire year passes, their relentless training settles into a familiar rhythm. Mars begins to find an unusual sense of satisfaction in pursuing this shared purpose, watching their separate ambitions gradually merge into one powerful collective force beneath countless moonlit nights. He is satisfied to see that their interests have finally become equally insane. For some of the soldiers, however, the direction of their training grows increasingly strange. They are ordered to lift enormous, grotesque weights, their muscles trembling as they are repeatedly commanded to raise the massive loads even higher, despite having little understanding of what these bizarre exercises are supposed to accomplish. Yet the physical labor proves to be only the beginning. The real ordeal comes at mealtime, when Mars watches the soldiers being ordered to eat the raw, highly potent flesh of the monsters they have killed, a practice intended to strengthen both their bodies and their minds by forcing them to absorb this primal power. Rumors soon spread through the ranks about Mars's own extraordinary accomplishments. While some soldiers are still limited to eating the flesh of weaker killer rabbits, they are stunned to learn that their leader has already advanced to consuming dragon meat. The feat confirms his place as the strongest among them and completely reshapes their understanding of what true greatness looks like. Sitting atop the enormous corpse of a slain monster, Mars reflects on how dramatically his life has changed. The genuine respect these warriors now show him is something he had never truly received while living as a prince, leaving him caught between pride in what he has built and a more somber reflection on the difference between his former life and the one he leads now. Far from their training grounds, inside the cold stone headquarters of the Black Knights of Phelan, Commander Crone receives reports about the group's activities. His eyes narrow as he hears of warriors who spend their days fighting and their nights eating the flesh of monsters, a practice completely unheard of among civilized military forces. The reports fill Crone with cold, righteous anger. In his mind, warriors deliberately consuming monster flesh cannot simply be engaging in unusual training. He suspects something darker, perhaps an evil cult or corruption caused by sinister blood. Convinced that the 100 poses a growing threat, he vows to destroy the organization personally before its unnatural strength can plunge the realm into chaos. Unaware of the trouble gathering in the capital, the mercenary organization continued to expand. Their towering commander led his men into the wilderness with a booming shout, eager to teach the latest recruits how to hunt while warning them not to collapse beneath the strain of their new and merciless way of life. He reminded them of the organization's most important law. Every monster they killed had to be eaten. No matter how talented someone might be with a sword, anyone unwilling to consume the flesh of their prey would never be allowed to advance through the ranks or take part in the 100's prestigious ranking matches. While he focused his ambitions on the 100, others within the organization's hidden structure were enduring challenges of their own. Cassandra stared uneasily at the dark slab of monster flesh being held out to her. The soldier encouraged her to eat it, insisting that despite its terrible taste, it would make her stronger. She hesitated, wondering whether gaining power truly required sinking to something so grotesque, and whether the reward could possibly justify the price. Eventually, she gave in, only to find the experience utterly revolting. Gagging on the disgusting meat, she became convinced that the 100 really was some kind of sinister cult, and even suspected that the man feeding her might be attempting to poison her. After wiping her mouth, she silently resolved to endure the ordeal until she had gathered enough evidence to destroy the organization, completely unaware of how drastically her own beliefs would soon change. Nor was she the only person transformed by an entire year spent in such a brutal environment. The young prince had changed just as dramatically. His body felt renewed, every muscle now overflowing with unnatural strength. Amazed by the enormous increase in his physical abilities, he concluded that sacrificing his former tastes in food had been a minor price for power of this magnitude. His evolution was not unique. During that same year, Cassandra underwent a profound transformation of her own. Once, she had questioned her sanity for remaining among them, but now she had discovered a dark and almost intoxicating pleasure in the pursuit of raw strength. The uncertainty that had once filled her eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory intensity. At last, she understood why they were so obsessed with the power they sought. Her transformation unfolded alongside his rise to the top. He had become the unquestioned leader known as Zero, an untouchable warrior standing at the absolute summit of the 100. He had mastered legendary abilities such as Sonic Blade and Magic Barrier, techniques believed to have vanished with the founders of the kingdom. Yet, despite his overwhelming strength, he freely passed his knowledge on to those beneath him. Watching him, Cassandra felt an awe-approaching religious devotion, concluding that trying to dominate someone with such an almost divine spirit would be nothing short of sacrilege. Zero had become the embodiment of everything the group represented, warriors forged into strength through the harshest possible conditions. Within this secret refuge, he had finally found a genuine purpose that made his life feel worth living, far removed from the suffocating obligations of his former existence. This new way of life gave him a clarity he had never experienced before. The nobility dismissed the 100 as little more than savages, while ordinary people regarded them as allies because they hunted the monsters terrorizing their communities. Compared with this dangerous yet vibrant existence, his life as a prince, where assassins constantly sought his death, now seemed empty and meaningless. Still, no matter how much he preferred life in the wilderness, politics eventually found its way back to him. Returning to the cold stone halls of the palace, he was confronted with a direct question about the very organization he secretly commanded. The 100 was described with open contempt as a crazed and evil cult spreading across the region, slaughtering monsters and consuming their flesh. He stood before the king, a man whose heavy features matched the weight of his expectations. Gamma pointed out that the prince's achievements had been unimpressive at best and argued that something drastic had to change if he hoped to secure his position as the kingdom's future ruler. With a calculating expression, the monarch prepared to present what he considered the solution to his son's shortcomings. The king proposed an audacious course of action. The prince himself would command the operation to destroy the 100. If he succeeded in defeating the organization, his military ability would earn recognition both within the kingdom and beyond its borders, proving beyond doubt that he deserved to inherit the throne. The bitter irony was immediately obvious to the prince, who now found his two identities placed directly against one another. The king delivered the order with cold certainty, stating that no one was more appropriate for the job of crushing crushing the supposed bandits than his own son. The prince remained frozen as the weight of those words struck him like a physical blow. Inside, disbelief screamed through his mind. His father was effectively ordering him to destroy the secret identity and life he had spent years building. As the king demanded an answer, his thoughts raced through the political trap laid before him. He quickly understood that this was far more than an ordinary military assignment. It was a calculated act of retaliation from a father who had begun to perceive him as a threat. If he obeyed and destroyed the 100, the growing support he had gained among the common people would disappear immediately, leaving him politically isolated and exposed. Despite the chaos inside his mind, he lowered his head in forced obedience and accepted the mission in a calm voice. A thin, strained smile appeared across his face, concealing the frantic calculations taking place behind his eyes. The trap had already closed around him, and when he departed from the king's presence, only one question dominated his thoughts. How could he possibly survive a choice in which every option seemed disastrous? As he walked through the palace's silent and luxurious corridors, the prince considered the betrayal behind the king's command. He knew his father was attempting to force him into a position that would damage his reputation and destroy his standing, but he had no intention of becoming a piece in such an obvious game. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted when he entered his private chambers and discovered an unexpected visitor waiting inside. A pale-haired young woman sat calmly in a chair, carrying an elegant yet mysterious air, her intense gaze already fixed directly upon him. She addressed him by name with such familiarity that a chill ran through him, casually commenting on how much time had passed since they had last met. He stared at her in confusion, searching his memory for any recollection of the unfamiliar woman who dared speak to him so boldly within the center of the royal palace. Remaining cautious and keeping his distance, he wondered whether she might be another assassin sent to complete what the king's command had begun. He could not understand how she had entered his chambers without anyone noticing. Although she lacked the overt hostility of a typical killer, her presence carried something far more intimidating. The mysterious woman paid no attention to his suspicion. Instead, she made an offer aimed directly at the crisis he was facing. Acknowledging the difficult position he had been placed in, she asked whether he wanted access to her power. He studied her carefully, immediately noticing that her presence was far too refined and distinguished for an ordinary mercenary or assassin. For a moment, it feels as though the entire world freezes when she corrects herself and quietly speaks the name he has kept hidden from everyone. Zero. His eyes widen in genuine shock, his breath catching as he realizes that his secret no longer belongs solely to him. The young prince now stands surrounded by some of the kingdom's most influential figures, their expressions revealing a mixture of determination and concealed motives. At the center of the gathering, he remains resolute, positioned between the mysterious silver-haired warrior and the refined lady from the magic division. The elegant woman suddenly addresses him, leaning closer with an expression that is both gentle and serious. She calls him not only by his royal name, but also by his hidden alias, before presenting him with a choice and asking whether he wants the power she can offer. He draws back slightly, genuine confusion tightening his expression as he searches his memory for any recognition of her face. Her eyes become distant, touched by a faint sadness when she realizes that he truly has no memory of the connection they once shared. His breath catches when she calmly reveals who she is, stating with complete certainty that she is his betrothed. The declaration hits him with the force of a physical blow, completely overturning his understanding of his own life. All he can manage is a sharp gasp of disbelief. His eyes remain wide as he stares at the young woman who has suddenly claimed such an important place in his past. Trying to recover his composure, he quickly stammers out an apology and insists that he does, in fact, remember her. His curiosity soon overwhelms the act, however, and he cautiously asks why she addressed him by the name connected to his secret life. His thoughts remain conflicted even as she tells him that she has never stopped watching over him. Years have passed since they last met, and he cannot understand how she could possibly have uncovered his hidden identity as the leader of the 100. She pays little attention to his confusion and instead focuses on the luminous magical circle forming between her hands. She explains that this ancient crest binds their destinies together in a way that cannot be undone. He listens silently as she reveals that the magical bond does far more than simply connect them. Through it, she can see through his eyes and even travel across enormous distances to appear beside him in an instant. Looking down at the glowing mark now engraved upon his body, he feels the weight of this new alliance, and all the secrets she possesses settle heavily upon him. His thoughts return to a distant childhood memory, when a young Frau used a strange spell that left both of them with marks resembling ordinary birthmarks. At the time, he assumed it was simply a ceremonial ritual meant to confirm their engagement, little more than a childish act between two noble children that he barely considered significant at the time. Now, however, cold sweat forms across his brow as the true implications motivations become clear. If the mark has remained active throughout all these years, then she has potentially been observing everything he has done through their pact. The discovery instantly makes her seem far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. What he once dismissed as nothing more than an interesting reminder of their bond suddenly carries an entirely different meaning. Frau looks at him with an intensity that seems to span all the years between them and softly remarks that, in truth, they have been together ever since that fateful day, her eyes revealing a connection both profound and unsettling. Their relationship began when they were only 8 years old, when their fathers introduced them with the intention that they would one day be wed. At the time, she considered him completely unremarkable. Despite his expensive clothing and royal status, he seemed like an entirely ordinary prince and failed to interest her in the slightest. Even though she initially felt nothing toward him, she had recently learned a new spell involving a pact mark and decided that the young prince would make a convenient subject for testing it. The experiment succeeded perfectly, leaving her pleased with the results while he remained completely unaware of what the spell truly did. Several years passed until he reached the age of 11, when a powerful poison ravaged his body and brought him frighteningly close to an early death. Following that near-fatal experience, his behavior changed in an unusual way. He began eating raw monster flesh. The strange development caught her attention and prompted her to activate the dormant contract and observe him for the first time in years. Her curiosity intensified as she watched him somehow endure the poison through their shared connection. With every grotesque meal he consumed, she noticed his magical power increasing. Fascinated by what she was witnessing, she even tried following his example and eating monster meat herself. Although she found the taste completely disgusting, she remained curious about whether his power would continue to grow. Now, with a growing sense of dread, he realizes that his supposedly private life has effectively been open for her to observe all along, though he decides to deal with that problem later. Frau, meanwhile, gives him a peaceful smile and admits that she has never once become bored of watching him. Meanwhile, at the fortress serving as Hundred's base, the commander stands clad in heavy plate armor as he questions the conditions of a proposed alliance. He asks what exactly it means for someone to lend their power, but the discussion is postponed with a promise that the details will be explained later. Standing among the assembled leaders, he considers how dramatically the balance of power within Phelan has begun to change. The kingdom's military structure is splintering after Kron and Warren, commanders of the Red and Black Knight orders, unexpectedly sided with the resistance organization known as 100. The development is enormous given the specialized responsibilities of the four orders. While the White and Blue Knights continue serving the crown and protecting the capital, the Red and Black Knights, the forces normally responsible for foreign expeditions and monster suppression, have now joined the opposing faction. Recognizing the seriousness of what lies ahead, the veteran commander turns toward the young leader, known as Zero, and remarks on the oppressive tension hanging over everyone as they prepare for the approaching conflict. The situation carries an obvious irony. Kron and Warren had originally been sent specifically to eliminate 100, yet they are now standing alongside the very people they were supposed to destroy. Moving before the assembled soldiers, the two commanders publicly declare their complete support for Zero, promising that they will follow him until this conflict reaches its final conclusion. Their pledge sends a mixture of hope and uncertainty through the troops. Many now view Zero as their only realistic chance of defeating the corrupt regime, although they remain unsure what following him to the very end will ultimately mean for their cause. Some soldiers begin voicing their doubts, questioning whether turning against their own nation can truly be justified and fearing that their actions may ignite a full-scale civil war. Zero immediately rejects the idea that he intends to lead a rebellion. He firmly states that he has no desire to become a traitor and would rather abandon the country entirely than launch a destructive uprising against his own homeland. To eliminate their uncertainty once and for all, he reaches for his mask and removes it. The face beneath sends a wave of shock through the assembled ranks, with soldiers gasping in disbelief as they recognize the true identity of the man they have been following. Standing openly before them as the realization spreads, Prince Mars explains that his actions have never represented a rebellion against Phelan. He is a legitimate prince of the kingdom, and his struggle is about reclaiming what rightfully belongs to him. Mars remains silent for a moment after exposing both his identity and his intentions to everyone around him. The revelation that Zero is actually Prince Mars hangs heavily over the gathering, and he wonders whether his followers fully understand the significance of what they have just learned. Noticing their hesitation, the commander steps forward and clarifies the situation. This is not an ordinary rebellion, he argues, but a legitimate struggle for succession. By supporting the rightful heir to the throne, they have effectively become the side fighting for justice, although one younger soldier nearby still struggles to reconcile that reality with the relatively small force they once represented. Outside the immediate leadership circle, however, Hundred's ranks have expanded to more than 1,000 fighters. Murmurs spread throughout the army as the men wonder how their organization grew so so quickly and why circumstances have carried them to a point from which there is no return. Prince Mars notices their increasing anxiety and understands that he must stabilize their resolve quickly. Even with an army behind him, the royal castle remains an extraordinarily difficult fortress to conquer, and he needs to make his followers understand the brutal reality awaiting them without destroying their confidence. As the tension continues building, everyone's attention turns toward the arrival of another vital faction. The movement has gained support not only from established knightly orders, but also from the kingdom's formidable magic division as well. At the head of this new force stands the young woman known as the Empress of Thunder, who formally announces that her division is joining Prince Mars's side. Her unexpected arrival surprises him, although several others appear to have already known she was coming. The soldiers watch with amazement as she joins the other leaders. Although many among the troops still do not fully understand how extensive their network of alliances has become, the atmosphere slowly shifts away from uncertainty and toward expectation. Her reputation alone carries enormous weight, and seeing such a powerful mage among their allies immediately raises morale. The men begin to believe that victory may genuinely be possible. She assumes command of the magical forces with composed confidence, while Mars continues watching her, still unable to understand just how deeply committed she is to his cause. Eventually, he takes her aside and asks why she would place so much at risk for an engagement that had originally been nothing more than a political arrangement created by their parents. She responds that she is simply beginning to behave as a proper fiancé should, before revealing the darker truth behind her extraordinary strength. She acquired that power by consuming monster flesh. The prince finds himself increasingly fascinated by her determination and by the dangerous road she has chosen to walk. As for her, the indifference she once felt is completely gone, replaced by such deep concern that she can no longer imagine abandoning a man who seems to live constantly on the brink of death. He remains silent while his fiancée looks at him with a gentle but unwavering smile. She once again expresses how happy she is about their engagement and promises to stay beside him, watching over whatever path he chooses. Her devotion clearly catches him by surprise, but she brushes aside his unease, focusing entirely on the future they will share. As the alliance finally comes together, cries for war erupt from the assembled ranks, the soldiers proclaiming that victory is now assured. The powerful commanders take their positions. Warren of the Red Knights and Kron of the Black Knights stand prepared, while Frau, the Empress of Thunder, readies her devastating magic. Everything is now in place for a war capable of reshaping the kingdom. At the center of this gathering of overwhelming power stands the young prince, caught in a storm he never truly meant to create. Behind him, Agma and the 100 warriors represent the formidable strength now under his command. The reality strikes him all at once. Every major figure has gathered here, and they have chosen him as the one to lead them. The soldiers' excitement reaches its peak as they roar in defiance, promising to cleanse the kingdom of its corrupt nobility. Mars watches the countless raised fists and shouting faces in silence, witnessing the violent momentum of the rebellion he has set in motion, despite how heavily the odds now seem to favor them. Even so, he feels strangely detached from the throne everyone is determined to capture in his name. He wonders when his private struggle somehow became a full-scale war for the crown and realizes that the road ahead is no longer something he can simply abandon. Surrounded by the cheers of his supporters, he begins the march toward the capital with his ultimate fate still uncertain. Mars thinks back to the impossible decision he faced after being ordered to destroy the 100. At that moment, only two choices remained: disappear into hiding or resist openly. He chose rebellion, and now he understands that there is no longer any path back. His thoughts end with quiet certainty as he turns his gaze away, as though the full weight of that decision has already embedded itself deep within his heart. Around him, his newly gathered allies burn with determination, Commander Agma among them. They call out to him as both Prince Mars and Zero, their voices carrying the desperate belief that he can guide them to victory. The burden of those expectations presses heavily upon him. After spending most of his life alone, he now finds himself surrounded by people whose absolute faith in him is something he cannot simply discard. Nearby, the Empress of Thunder watches him closely without ever looking away. She understands that by choosing this course, Mars has made himself a direct enemy of the very kingdom he once belonged to, yet she cannot stop watching the man he is becoming. Smiling with determination, she offers her strength completely to his cause. She promises to fight beside him and ensure that their rebellion succeeds, her eyes filled with the resolve to see the struggle through to its conclusion. When the march finally begins, Mars sits astride his horse amid the noise of soldiers preparing for battle. Through the commotion, a voice asks whether the tension visible on his face comes from the fact that this will be his first genuine battlefield engagement, remarking that the day to overturn the old order has finally arrived. Elsewhere, their enemies prepare a strategy of their own. Commander Crone sits imposingly atop his mount and instructs King Gamaras to remain behind behind while the Black and Red Knight orders handle the main fighting. He states plainly that their single objective is the complete destruction of the rebel commander known as Zero. Back among his own forces, however, Mars has no illusions about the Crown's supposed reinforcements. He knows that the White Knights, made up of noble-born soldiers loyal to Gamera's, are far more likely to betray him than defend him. In his eyes, they have not been deployed to help him win, but to guarantee that he dies in the chaos of battle. Seated on his horse with the weight of the approaching conflict pressing heavily upon him, Mars listens as a soldier reports that the vanguard is ready to advance. Before the army can properly begin its march, Commander Crone approaches and, in a cold and controlled voice, requests one final conversation with the young prince. Crone casually argues that there is no reason for royalty to personally stain his hands fighting the commoners of the 100. Commander Warren immediately cuts in, however, reminding the nobleman that he has no right to address a prince with such familiarity. The public reprimand clearly strikes a nerve. Crone's expression tightens into silent, simmering fury as he absorbs the humiliation. Despite the hostility simmering among the commanders, the enormous formation of armored knights begins moving steadily forward, the synchronized pounding of hooves rolling across the open plains. Within the advancing ranks, the noble-born soldiers exchange mocking laughter, ridiculing the idea of commoners pretending to be knights and complaining that such people represent the decline of their once proud tradition of chivalry. Gazing toward the distant towers of the capital, the prince takes note of Crone and Warren's unusual enthusiasm and realizes that he will have to steel his heart for the betrayal he already knows is coming. Turning toward the assembled forces, he raises his voice with commanding authority and declares that their true enemy lies within the capital itself, specifically identifying the 100 as their objective. With that declaration, the opening strike is made. The prince surges forward at incredible speed, his sword slicing through the air as he knocks an opposing rider from his horse in one smooth movement. The surrounding knights burst into cheers, praising both the accuracy and force of the attack, though there is something deliberately exaggerated about their admiration, concealing the intentions they truly harbor. Looking down at the fallen knight with a cold, perceptive expression, the prince states that their plan to assassinate him had been painfully obvious regardless of how the battle ended. Trembling inside his white armor, the defeated knight can only stammer in disbelief, unable to understand how his secret betrayal was discovered. As the frightened men beg for mercy and insist that they were merely following orders from their superiors, he feels nothing but disgust. With one swift and decisive swing of his sword, he cuts their excuses short, declaring that genuine peace can never exist in a kingdom where corrupt and cowardly men like them are permitted to remain alive. Returning to his horse, he joins the commanders who have remained loyal to him as they prepare to advance toward the capital. At his side, the imposing Agma speaks about the disgrace that has stained the White Knights and the necessity of restoring true justice to the kingdom, while the prince privately considers just how unwavering and almost disturbing the loyalty of his companions has become. The intensity burning in his allies' eyes is almost difficult to face, silently revealing the overwhelming conviction driving their cause forward. Their attention shifts toward the distant towers of the royal capital, and they recognize that their opportunity is rapidly disappearing. The campaign has become a desperate race against time, and the prince understands that those entrenched behind the city's defenses are almost certainly monitoring every move they make. When they finally reach the enormous stone walls, voices immediately rise from the battlements. The Blue Knights recognize their leader and shout orders for the gates to be secured behind him so that their position can be protected. The commander of the Blue Knights personally supervises as the massive iron gates swing open. He greets the arriving knight with an approving nod, recognizing the crucial role his forces are playing in the rebellion. As he rides through the entrance, cheers rise from the Blue Knights, who promise to keep the streets of the capital under control. Their loyalty remains unwavering as they wish him success with the final confrontation now drawing closer. The streets of the city have become a military staging ground, crowded with moving troops as the royal army begins establishing its occupation. Amid the growing tension, Agma and the common-born warriors of the 100 are met with contemptuous looks from the remaining noble knights. When those nobles ridicule their abilities and call them filth, the commoners tighten their hands around their weapons, prepared to demonstrate that mastery of the sword has nothing to do with noble blood. The prince watches the disorder unfold as a veteran soldier throws himself directly into the fighting, shouting that there is no room for vanity on a battlefield. The warrior mocks any talk of lofty principles, insisting that real strength can only be demonstrated through the complete destruction of the enemy. Continuing his savage assault, he cuts through his opponents while declaring that overwhelming force is the only true answer to violence. Surrounded by carnage, he becomes a grim embodiment of the philosophy he preaches. As combat continues, some observe that the 100 are still regarded by many as little more than a collection of ordinary criminals. Yet they expect that perception to change once the tower's mages enter the conflict conflict and bring the devastating might of the Mage Core to Mars' side. Inside the sacred halls of the Mage Tower, word of Prince Mars' uprising reaches the Empress of Thunder. Standing with her usual elegance and composure, she turns toward her father and delivers a single grave demand, one capable of permanently altering the future of their bloodline. Her father's expression twists in disbelief when he hears her ultimatum. She orders him to step down immediately and transfer the family's title to her, filling the chamber with the oppressive weight of her ambition. He stammers helplessly, unable to comprehend that she could demand his abdication at such a moment and in such a place. She answers his confusion with an icy, unwavering stare, her determination as sharp as a blade. He dismisses her request as nothing more than a misguided fantasy, reminding her that tradition forbids a woman from becoming head of the family and insisting that he has no intention of retiring anytime soon. Disappointment briefly flashes across her face before giving way to an unnervingly calm expression. Without saying another word, she begins gathering her enormous magical power, a radiant magic circle taking shape before her. Her father recoils in fear, realizing far too late that his daughter is no longer seeking his approval. A violent burst of magical energy explodes outward, ripping through the assembled mages with the force of a lightning strike. Even the soldiers fighting below feel the shockwaves, witnessing the first stage of a terrifying power being unleashed. She observes the destruction with cold detachment, explaining that once the initial shock and lightning have passed, the explosion follows. Her final statement carries an even darker promise. Anyone fortunate enough to survive the blast will face complete dissolution afterward. Frau stands over her father and coldly demands one final time that he relinquish the family title. Gameras can only beg her to stop, but his pleas are abruptly drowned out when a violent torrent of electricity erupts from her hands. He screams in agony as brilliant white magic tears through his body. While striking him down, she softly asks her father to grant her this one final wish. Outside the castle, the sudden surge of power creates unease throughout the army. Soldiers exchange anxious looks, wondering whether something has gone wrong and why the expected reinforcements from the Mage Corps still have not appeared. Meanwhile, the young prince continues advancing through the chaos. He briefly thanks the loyal knights maintaining the front line, and they urge him to keep moving while they deal with the remaining resistance. Before long, he enters the palace's elaborate interior, where a stern voice suddenly calls his name. An official, horrified by what he considers an act of betrayal, condemns the uprising and declares that the prince's path toward the throne ends here, sentencing him to death in the name of the fallen king. Following that declaration, a group of powerful warriors steps forward and blocks his way. Their leader, a determined swordsman, draws his weapon and warns the prince to prepare himself for the fight that will determine the future of the kingdom. Mars remains steady as the hostile group surrounds him, their leader openly declaring that they intend to kill him. Yet even in the face of those threats, his thoughts drift toward his father, a man who never even bothered investigating his mother's death and cared only about protecting himself while allowing others to fight on his behalf. His enemies boast about how thoroughly they have prepared for this confrontation, claiming that powerful magic has already been used to restrain him and that elite A-rank adventurers were hired specifically to guarantee his defeat. Their leader sneers confidently, certain that additional reinforcements will soon arrive and complete the trap, leaving Mars with no possible route of escape. Mars, however, remains completely unfazed and moves with unnatural ease despite the crushing gravity magic weighing down his body. The blonde knight stares in disbelief, unable to understand how anyone could withstand such pressure. Mars casually explains that years of brutal training have already made burdens like this familiar to him. When their magic proves ineffective, a hooded attacker charges forward and drenches him with a substance extracted from a poison lizard, confidently promising that paralysis will follow immediately. Mars merely pauses as the memory of an especially disgusting meal comes back to him. He realizes that because he once consumed the same kind of creature, his body has already developed a natural immunity to its toxin. In the next instant, he explodes forward with terrifying speed, drawing his sword and tearing through the armored mercenaries. His movements become a blur of lethal accuracy as his blade cuts through their ranks with almost no resistance, their armor proving completely useless against his overwhelming physical strength. The mages' desperate screams fill the chamber as the battle turns against them in an instant. The once confident adventurers are seized by overwhelming terror as their formation collapses beneath the prince's relentless assault. One after another, they fall, their bodies left broken and bloodied by the sheer force behind his attacks. The blonde knight can only stare in horror as his companions are destroyed within seconds, finally understanding the monstrous scale of Mars's strength as the chamber transforms into a scene of complete carnage. Looking across the remains of their failed ambush, the survivors confront the hopeless reality of their situation. Even the most talented healers would be unable to repair wounds this severe. The knowledge that they are completely outclassed settles over them, leaving only a desperate and almost meaningless hope of survival. Mars looks over the destruction he has caused and quietly apologizes for failing to restrain himself. It has been a long time since he fought without the limiting effects of his bracelet, and in the intensity of battle, he simply lost control of the immense strength he normally keeps suppressed. He remains calm while the surviving adventurers desperately coordinate another attack. Their leader shouts instructions, ordering Mika to prepare an offensive spell, Luda to provide support, and Chad to distract the prince. Unbothered by the chaos surrounding him, Mars prepares a technique of his own, the Sonic Blade. Chad's attempt at distraction ends immediately when Mars cuts him down with a single devastating strike. Panic spreads through the group as they shout in disbelief and rush to heal their fallen companion. In one final attempt to halt the prince's advance, another adventurer summons blazing crimson flames. A gigantic inferno takes shape in the form of a predatory beast, roaring to life as the mage sends it charging toward her enemy. Screaming for him to burn, she unleashes the attack, and the unbearable heat floods the area in a blinding burst of light. He calmly watches the wall of fire close in, recognizing that the attack is far too broad to dodge. Even so, there is no fear in his expression, only cold calculation, as a shimmering barrier marked with an avian pattern forms before him to withstand the flames. The devastating fire slams into the magical shield and breaks apart into harmless sparks. The mages can only stare in horror as their strongest spell is completely nullified without leaving so much as a scratch on its target. The blonde knight and the young mage remain frozen in disbelief. They know that only extremely powerful monsters are normally capable of producing such a formidable magical barrier, and the realization that even their greatest efforts are useless slowly begins to sink in. He gives them a faint smirk and explains that he acquired the ability by consuming the flesh of a demon ape. The revelation exposes just how unnatural his development has become, and he takes grim satisfaction in the fear spreading across their faces. Emerging through the fading smoke, he advances with a presence so overwhelming that it seems to weigh down the entire room. Looking coldly at the remaining survivors, he declares that the time has come to settle everything once and for all. He gives them one final opportunity to stand aside, making it clear that he does not wish to spill any more blood. The blonde knight refuses. Driven by grief over his fallen companion and pride in his status as an A-rank adventurer, he draws his sword and prepares for one final, suicidal confrontation. The prince closes the gap in an instant, moving too quickly for the eye to properly follow. The knight barely manages to bring up his weapon before they collide in a violent burst of sparks and ringing steel. He acknowledges that the knight is genuinely skilled, but decides that the exchange has lasted long enough and prepares to finish it with a decisive blow. With a sudden explosion of movement, he drives a devastating kick into his opponent, cracking the stone floor beneath them and sending the knight crashing into the rubble. Standing over the defeated man, he calmly explains that his master's training was never limited to swordsmanship alone. The knight can only stare in disbelief at such an unexpected fighting method. The prince then turns his cold attention toward the only remaining man, Gemerad. The official begins trembling, his face drained of color as the prince informs him that he is now the final obstacle left in the chamber. Terror overtakes Gemerad as he desperately attempts to justify everything he has done, convincing himself that every act of betrayal and every political scheme was committed for the sake of the kingdom he claimed to love. His mind returns 15 years into the past, to an era of complete disorder when he successfully manipulated King Gameras into launching a coup against the previous queen in order to save the realm. Gemerad believed that only he could maintain the necessary balance between morality and corruption and guide the kingdom through its political dangers. Yet the very existence of the young prince threatened to destabilize the carefully constructed system he had built. Convinced that the boy would eventually become nothing more than a puppet controlled by ambitious nobles, Gemerad believed he had no alternative but to act before the child could be exploited. Even though he knew the prince had committed no crime, he coldly concluded that the boy had to be removed entirely if his own vision for the kingdom was to survive. Yet despite everything, the young man endured every assassination attempt and every trap prepared for him. Now he has returned to announce the end of the corrupt nobility's rule, with his loyal commanders gathering behind him. Gemerad stands stunned as the full reality finally settles over him. With the noble faction essentially destroyed, only Gamerad remains as a recognized authority figure. The prince questions whether the purge of the corrupt elite has truly reached its conclusion, his thoughts racing through the consequences of such an abrupt power. Vacuum. Nearby, the victorious commanders assemble, the sound of their heavy armor echoing through the chamber as they examine the aftermath. They voice the question now hanging over the entire palace. With the old ruling class gone, who still possesses the experience and legitimacy necessary to govern the kingdom? Watching the discussion unfold, Gamerad breaks into a cold sweat as the truth finally dawns on him. Prince Mars, the man known as Zero, had secretly and methodically constructed an independent power base of his own. His thoughts race through the new political reality. The incompetent hundred clearly lack the ability to govern, leaving him to wonder whether the former king, Gamarad, may be the only realistic choice capable of restoring stability to the realm. The young prince then turns toward his father, the former king Gamarad, who sits nearby looking exhausted and uncertain. Speaking in a steady tone that leaves no room for debate, Mars declares that the throne belongs to his father, effectively returning the former monarch to his rightful position. The announcement leaves the older man completely stunned, his mouth hanging open as he struggles to process the sudden return of the crown. He weakly objects, telling his son that he could at least hesitate for a moment before dumping such an enormous responsibility back onto him, but Mars remains completely firm. As the chaos of the rebellion begins to subside, finding someone capable of managing the kingdom becomes increasingly urgent. The prince surveys the room until his gaze settles on the trembling Gamarad, who is still struggling to understand how rapidly the political situation has changed. Pointing directly at the terrified official, Mars speaks with unquestionable authority. He orders Gamarad to take responsibility for the kingdom's complicated day-to-day administration, effectively forcing the man into government service. The official can only stare at him in complete disbelief, his eyes widening as his breath catches. After conspiring to seize power for himself, he is now being handed that very authority. But under the direct supervision of the prince he once attempted to murder, leaving him utterly speechless. In the days that follow, stability returns to the kingdom with surprising speed as the new administration takes control. With order restored, preparations begin for a magnificent celebration marking the marriage of the prince and his betrothed, Frau. She stands before the assembled knights as a figure combining elegance with undeniable strength, having already proven herself in battle. Her courage during the Civil War earned the military's unwavering respect, and she now takes her place as one of the central pillars of the new era. Yet she casually begins considering her next undertaking, darkly suggesting a summoning ritual involving human sacrifices, prompting those around her to question whether she is truly suited to become queen. Meanwhile, the veteran warriors voice serious concerns, reminding the new king that the man he appointed to oversee the kingdom once tried to assassinate him and could still pose a threat to the throne. Uncertainty about the new political order remains. Sitting atop a mountain of defeated enemies, the commanders question whether strength on the battlefield can truly translate into the ability to govern a kingdom. Despite their doubts, the newly appointed administrator, Gemarad, throws himself to the ground in an overwhelming display of emotion, weeping as he swears absolute loyalty and offers his life in service to his new ruler. At the center of a grand ceremony, the crown is formally placed upon him, officially marking his rise as the new king. The halls thunder with cheers from loyal subjects and warriors promising to follow him wherever he leads. Yet the young monarch quietly reflects on the irony of it all. His original goal had been nothing more than staying alive, and somehow that simple desire has brought him beneath the enormous burden of leadership. Standing beside his new queen in ceremonial attire, the king looks completely different from the desperate warrior who once survived by devouring monster flesh. Both the weight of the crown and the memory of his extraordinary path to power remain with them as they prepare to confront the challenge of rebuilding a shattered nation. The towers of the royal palace stretch into the sky, silently marking both the conclusion of one journey and the intimidating beginning of another. As the sounds of the coronation gradually fade, only one certainty remains in this constantly changing world. Countless new trials and victories still await the newly established government. A severed limb is raised into the air like a horrific prize from a savage competition. Nearby, the young attendant Frau recoils in absolute horror, her eyes wide as she stares at the bloody scene unfolding during the ranking matches of the elite organization known as the Hundred. The gruesome result came from a battle between two ranked fighters, during which the stronger Agma decisively mutilated his opponent, Bruno. Watching the aftermath, Gamarad considers the kingdom's changing financial situation. Although confiscating the property of the nobility has strengthened the treasury, the kingdom still owes an enormous debt of gratitude to the Hundred for the role they played during the rebellion. While considering both that debt and the violent spectacle before him, inspiration suddenly strikes the young king. Raising a finger, he announces a bold new idea. They will construct an enormous arena. His advisor, Gamarad, stops to consider the proposal, his expression tightening as he asks for clarification. He wants to know whether the king intends to take these private contests of strength and transform them into entertainment that ordinary citizens can watch. The king confirms exactly that, explaining his plan to turn the ranking battles into one of the nation's premier attractions. By selling admission tickets, he argues, the government could transform these demonstrations of martial ability into a financially sustainable enterprise. The implications suddenly click into place for the advisor, whose eyes widen as he recognizes the plan's true economic potential. He excitedly blurts out the word that changes everything. Gamarad grows increasingly enthusiastic, praising what he believes to be see the king's extraordinary foresight while recognizing that Phelan lacks any major industry of its own. In his eyes, everything, from the creation of the 100 to this latest business venture, must have been part of an elaborate strategy designed from the beginning to rescue the impoverished nation. Carried away by his own excitement, the advisor immediately promises to begin making the necessary preparations, fully convinced that the arena will become an essential asset for the entire nation. The young king, slightly overwhelmed by his enthusiasm, simply lets the man's momentum push the project ahead. Months of construction follow, and within half a year, an enormous stone coliseum rises above the surrounding landscape. The massive structure becomes a symbol of the kingdom's new direction, soon packed with spectators eagerly awaiting the violence to unfold. Inside the completed arena, however, the true cost of that entertainment becomes painfully clear when Aaron rushes forward carrying his badly wounded companion, Barry. He desperately begs for a healer to save his friend, even as the kingdom's treasury swells from the double profits generated by the frantic wagers of the audience. He watches in horror as Louisa, the kingdom's finest healer, recoils at the sight of Barry. Pointing to the sword still lodged in his chest, she screams that saving him is impossible and insists that he is already nothing more than a corpse. Trembling with shock, she demands to know why his own friend would have done something so horrific. The warrior refuses to accept her conclusion, shouting that there is still time and insisting that she is the only person capable of bringing Barry back. He warns that if his friend does not return to life, even he cannot say what he might do. Louisa can only stare at him in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the pressure. As the situation reaches its breaking point, one of their companions tries to calm the frantic warrior and urges him to regain control. Louisa remains frozen in place, her eyes wide as the full weight of what is happening finally settles over her. The desperate man surges forward once more, his face twisted with panic. He roars that if she refuses to act, more people will die and everyone will suffer the consequences. The force of his desperation leaves the healer visibly trembling. Another distraught companion joins him, and together the two men plead for her help. They fear that if Barry fails to recover, their entire group could collapse. Through her tears, Louisa's determination finally begins to solidify as she understands just how many lives now depend on her. Offering one final desperate prayer, she begins the difficult process of repairing the fatal injury, magical light gathering around her as she attempts to challenge death itself. Moments later, the impossible happens. Barry rises again, completely restored. Cheers erupt for the A-rank cleric, whose extraordinary skill has pulled a man back from the very edge of death. Louisa's relief quickly transforms into fierce, righteous anger. She turns on those responsible and warns them never to test her like this again, threatening to turn the next corpse into a zombie instead. The guards immediately agree to drag the offenders away to prison without protest. Elsewhere, away from the chaos, the king is approached by his advisor. Gamarez asks him to begin preparing for a special match, and the young monarch accepts the proposal with an exhausted sigh, recognizing that the event is necessary. Standing alone with one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, he acknowledges that from this moment onward, he must fully accept every burden and responsibility that comes with being king, regardless of the price. He stands within the crowded arena, surrounded by dust and the deafening roar of spectators. These are the days of the hundreds rankers, warriors who have gained both fame and wealth through their achievements in the fighting pits. Like Agma before them, they battle for the crowd's admiration and the promise of substantial prize money. Because of his position, however, he is constantly harassed by challengers such as Aaron, who demands that he remove his armlet and reveal the full strength he displayed during the rebellion. To satisfy the endless stream of rankers seeking a chance against him, he has committed himself to 10 exhausting matches every single day. The arrangement originally emerged out of necessity. He had once been endlessly pestered for duels, so he offered a compromise. Anyone who won a ranking match would earn the right to challenge him in a special bout afterward. At least that had been his intention. He believed quickly defeating them would finally silence their complaints, but the plan failed spectacularly. Now, in the middle of his 7th consecutive fight, he listens to proud warriors boasting that they have completed 100 matches without missing a single one, while others plead with him to hold back. Even with his exhaustion clearly showing, the challengers refuse to slow down. Their eyes burn with such relentless enthusiasm that they resemble zombies more than ordinary men. They shout that no matter how many times he knocks them down, they will keep getting back up, convinced that today will finally be the day they defeat him. As the fighting continues, Mars launches himself through the air, moving in a blur while defending against several opponents at once. Their voices overlap in a chaotic chorus as they shout his titles, King Mars, Lord Mars, while attacking relentlessly from every direction. A short while later, he stops briefly to recover, leaning heavily against his sword while sweat runs down his face. Every other fighter receives 5 full days of rest between matches, yet he is dragged into these special battles almost every day, leaving him to wonder why the burden of the arena seems seems to fall almost entirely on him. Meanwhile, Gameraz observes from the sidelines with a calculating expression, noting how dramatically the crowds grow whenever the king enters the arena. To the advisor, the spectacle is invaluable for public morale, but to the man actually standing in the dirt, it feels as though he has been reduced to little more than a gladiatorial slave. He now understands that bringing Waisa in for her healing magic was a double-edged decision. She keeps him healthy enough to continue fighting, but she also restores his opponents almost immediately. No matter how often he defeats them, they are simply patched up and sent back into battle, turning his existence into an endless nightmare of steel, exhaustion, and repeated combat. Even as he considers filing a formal complaint with Gameraz, another attack crashes into him and drags his attention straight back into the fight. The cycle refuses to end, a king trapped by his own decree in a war without conclusion. From afar, his advisor watches with a heavy heart, struggling with thoughts he cannot bring himself to express. Seeing the physical toll that the constant matches have taken on the young king, he realizes Mars is driving himself far beyond ordinary exhaustion, visibly growing thinner as he works relentlessly for the kingdom. Under such circumstances, criticizing him now would feel unbearably cruel. Through that relentless dedication, the young king once again emerges as the undisputed champion of the arena, the thunderous cheers of the audience confirming another victory. To the public, he remains an unshakable symbol of strength, even as his own reserves continue to diminish. Once the adrenaline fades, however, only empty exhaustion remains in his eyes as he acknowledges that the day's ranking matches have finally concluded. Yet even as he hopes for a brief moment of rest, an uneasy dread remains. He knows the real ordeal is only beginning, that next trial does not take place on the battlefield, but at the dining table, where an assortment of exotic meats has been prepared. For the warriors of this kingdom, true hell is served on a plate. He finds himself eating food that is essentially poisonous, forcing him to cast detoxification magic on himself with every bite. Beside him, the young mage trembles while frantically muttering cleansing spells over her own meal, as he reflects on the strange report that the once plentiful killer rabbit population is now approaching extinction. As they continue eating, he asks his advisor about the ecological change, wondering whether the monsters are actually being exterminated or simply abandoning the region. The notion that monster populations might not replenish endlessly challenges his assumptions about the natural laws of this world. Gameraz explains that even powerful dragons have started abandoning the skies, fleeing from the relentless appetite of the kingdom's strongest warriors. The Hundred and the Mage Corps hunt such creatures with ruthless determination, driven by their need for the precious, toxic flesh that strengthens their bodies. At first, Mars considers the disappearance of crop-destroying pests and dangerous apex predators beneficial for ordinary citizens. Yet the grim look on Gameraz's face suggests the issue is far more complicated. The creature's disappearance represents not only increased safety, but also a deeper disruption of the natural balance. The seriousness of the problem is reflected in the young scout's tearful expression as she forces herself to swallow the powerful meat. Gameraz explains that anyone who has not yet developed the conditioning of the Hundred finds the flesh of stronger monsters dangerously difficult for the body to tolerate. Looking down at the glistening and potentially lethal feast before him, Mars silently agrees with the mood of those around him. No matter how much strength the food provides, he increasingly longs for a meal chosen simply for its taste, rather than one that turns eating into another struggle for survival. Considering their increasingly desperate situation, he suggests a simple solution. If the elite need killer rabbit meat so badly, why not begin breeding the animals themselves instead of hunting them until they disappear from the region? Gameraz is momentarily speechless. His eyes widen in disbelief before his expression shifts into intense fascination and admiration at an idea so radically different from conventional thinking. Seeing how strongly the official reacts, the young king immediately grows uneasy, realizing that his casual suggestion about creating a sustainable source of meat could easily be interpreted by foreign nations as another sign of complete insanity. Gameraz continues questioning him, eventually dismissing both entertainment and food as the true purpose of the idea. Mars becomes increasingly confused, unable to understand where this strange discussion is going. Gameraz's imagination has already gone much further, envisioning domesticated monsters not as livestock, but as the foundation of an entirely new and terrifying military force. He points to the northern kingdoms, where dragons are bred and trained alongside riders, arguing that this already proves the military potential of such creatures. With an enthusiastic declaration, Gameraz resolves to pursue the concept and incorporate monsters into the kingdom's armed forces. Mars can only wonder whether his own ideas are slowly turning him into an actual demon lord. Desperate to stop the misunderstanding before it goes any further, Mars tries to shout out a denial, only to discover that his voice has completely disappeared. Unable to make a sound, he begins trembling in sudden, inexplicable silence. The reason becomes apparent when a pair of ears eerie, concentric eyes appears close before him, radiating such cold, oppressive intensity that he is instantly frozen in place. Frau has teleported directly to his side through their contract seal and used magic to bind his tongue. She had overheard the increasingly dangerous direction of the conversation and decided to intervene personally. Frau says nothing, but her presence fills the room with unmistakable pressure. Gamaraz, however, mistakes Mars's silence for agreement. Suddenly consumed by feverish ambition, he becomes convinced that breeding monsters will grant the kingdom overwhelming military superiority and immediately rushes away to begin preparations. Mars can only watch helplessly, realizing that once Frau becomes interested in something, attempting to stop her is pointless and could easily provoke a violent reaction. With her obsession now allowed to run unchecked, a disastrous chain of events begins. To the men involved, breeding monsters for warfare initially appears to be a brilliant military strategy, but Frau's fixation on the idea will ultimately bring disaster to everyone. At that moment, however, the true magnitude of the approaching catastrophe remains unseen, with the seeds of destruction quietly taking root within the kingdom. As Frau gently cradles a small winged creature, narration from the future warns of the darkness awaiting them. The relentless large-scale hunting of monsters by nations across the world will eventually cause a major calamity, directly resulting from the obsession now spreading throughout the kingdom. The castle silently witnesses these crucial moments in the nation ruled by the man history will later remember as Mad King Mars. Eventually, he will be forced to carry full responsibility for the consequences of these decisions, raising the question of just how crushing a king's burden becomes when his entire kingdom descends into madness. In the shadows of the kingdom of Phelan, an ominous new undertaking has begun. Monsters are being mass-produced in order to strengthen the nation's military forces. Amid these disturbing developments, Frau brings Mars another proposal. Secretly, he hopes the new distraction might provide him with an excuse to avoid an upcoming special match. While Mars considers the possibility of escape, Frau expresses unsettling delight at how powerful the kingdom is becoming, even questioning whether a nation this small truly requires an army of monsters. Their discussion is interrupted by Aaron, who enthusiastically approaches Mars carrying a matching present, a gravity bracelet. Proudly showing it off, he suggests that wearing the same accessory will make them feel even closer as comrades. Mars reacts with obvious confusion, prompting Aaron to explain the item's rather grim origins. The bracelet was originally used as a prisoner's restraint, designed to prevent escape by subjecting the wearer to overwhelming gravitational force. With a smug grin, Aaron continues describing the device while mocking the kingdom's elite soldiers. He then officially offers it to Mars as a specialized piece of training equipment, adding that someone can obtain one for free simply by committing a crime in another country. As Mars inspects the heavy bracelet, Frau reveals that she personally modified it, successfully enchanting the metal with an astonishing 5-fold gravity spell. The level of magical expertise required leaves Mars momentarily stunned by the extent of her concealed abilities. Impressive as the craftsmanship may be, Mars privately concludes that triple gravity is already more than sufficient for everyday use. Even so, he remains uneasy about the feeling of being constantly watched. That discomfort grows stronger when he remembers that Frau can continuously observe him through their contract sigil. The thought sends a chill through him as he becomes acutely aware of her gaze reaching him through the mark. Mars reflects that only his master, Cassandra, ever fully understood the severity of his circumstances. A woman whose terrifying stare and lethal reputation made it abundantly clear that skipping training could easily become a fatal mistake. His thoughts turn to the brutal artifacts he now carries, comparing the poisonous ring and triple gravity bracelet with the merciless training methods Cassandra once imposed upon him. Their constant pain and weight serve as unavoidable reminders of just how much strength he is expected to develop. Looking toward the young woman beside him, Mars remarks that magical protection would have made a far more pleasant gift than another punishing weight. Frau, however, clearly possesses a competitive side. Her expression darkens at the mention of the gifts his master gave him as she begins considering her own contribution to his growth. Between the growing burden of his responsibilities and the literal gravitational pressure dragging down his limbs, Mars breaks into a cold sweat while wondering what exactly his betrothed expects from him. Frau remains completely convinced that driving her future husband to the absolute limit of his physical abilities is the highest possible expression of a wife's devotion and responsibility. She suddenly leans closer with such intensity that Mars is left without words. Her piercing gaze remains locked onto him as she demands a clear answer to her proposal. Caught off guard by both her sudden closeness and unwavering focus, he can do nothing but stare back in stunned silence. Despite his uncertainty, he cannot overlook the depth of Frau's loyalty. He remembers how she put everything at risk during the rebellion and refused to sever their bond even when others pressured her to do so. With a quiet word of thanks, he accepts her latest gift, recognizing that although although she may not express emotion in conventional ways, her devotion to him is impossible to deny. The gravity enchantment proves far too powerful for the royal furniture, causing the throne beneath him to explode into splinters under the unnatural pressure. All he can do is sigh at the literal weight of his wife's affection, which has now become a physical burden he must endure throughout his everyday life. Elsewhere in the palace, the peaceful atmosphere is disturbed by the arrival of a messenger carrying news from the kingdom of Kadena. Gamaraz watches closely as the formal announcement is presented before the court, signaling an important change in the political situation. The significance of the message is immediately apparent. Kadena is not only an influential neighboring kingdom with a long history, but also a vital ally in the continuing struggle against the horrors emerging from the demon beast forest. Preserving strong diplomatic relations with them is essential if the realm hopes to survive the growing darkness. The young king accepts the sealed document with a faint smirk, pleased at the opportunity to finally engage in genuine affairs of state. He welcomes the chance to perform a responsibility truly worthy of his title and eagerly wonders what the neighboring monarch wishes to say to the new ruler of the Black Empire. As he reads through the letter, however, his confident royal expression quickly disappears, replaced by wide-eyed intensity. Whatever is written on the page clearly carries a burden far heavier than any gravity bracelet, triggering a grim realization powerful enough to threaten his newly acquired composure. His eyes widen further as he absorbs the contents. Kadena has submitted a formal complaint accusing his kingdom of disturbing the fragile ecosystem of the demon beast forest. Phelan's excessive hunting has unintentionally driven large numbers of monsters into Kadena's territory, and the neighboring kingdom is now demanding accountability along with an enormous payment of 3,000 gold coins in reparations. Looking at the wealth available in the treasury, Mars understands the seriousness of the problem. The money itself is available, but the diplomatic consequences are far more costly than the payment, forcing him to realize that the kingdom's recent achievements have carried an unseen price. Nearby, his advisor reacts with visible shock while gripping his own copies of the reports. He realizes that their relentless expansion and monster extermination became so effective that even dragons abandoned their territory, creating an ecological vacuum that surrounding nations are now being forced to absorb. Kadena is simply the first country to openly condemn their lack of foresight. The female warrior beside them immediately bristles at the accusation, responding with sharp disbelief. She argues that every nation should be responsible for defending its own borders and questions whether Kadena has any national pride at all if it must ask another kingdom for help with its monster problem instead of handling the situation itself. Yet the facts remain impossible to dispute. The Black Empire's ruthless efficiency within the demon beast forest has pushed the local monster population toward collapse, causing surviving creatures to migrate into neighboring territories where conditions are less hostile and creating a regional crisis that can no longer be dismissed. The armored knight beside her shows even less sympathy, openly shouting his contempt for what he sees as Kadena's weakness. If the kingdom has too many monsters, he argues, then they should simply hunt them for food or wipe them out entirely. In his eyes, demanding compensation for such a problem is pathetic behavior unworthy of an independent nation. Mars lets out a tired sigh at the aggressive reactions of his subordinates. He understands that although their military power is exceptional, not every problem can be resolved through violence. For the first time, he feels genuine sympathy for neighboring nations that simply do not possess their strength. A diplomat then explains how precarious the situation has become. Although the king of Kadena's demands are unreasonable by diplomatic standards, his anger is entirely genuine. As an envoy, he has no alternative but to present those demands to the court of Phelan, regardless of how the young king chooses to respond. The female warrior's earlier anger gradually gives way to exhausted resignation. She turns her gaze aside, her thoughts drifting away from the complications of international diplomacy toward the much simpler desire to return home and escape these disputes entirely. Despite the arguments taking place around him, Mars remains cold and impossible to read. To everyone observing him, his silence feels far more intimidating than anger would have been, leaving them with the unsettling impression that their ruler possesses an intensity few people could ever fully understand. He sits casually on his throne, his relaxed posture sharply contrasting with the rigid tension of the envoy standing before him. The diplomat nervously glances toward the young monarch, unsettled by how completely unaffected Mars appears by the seriousness of the situation. The envoy begins trembling when the young king responds with a deceptively innocent smile, an expression that feels disturbingly inappropriate inside a chamber filled with political schemes and unspoken threats. The diplomat cannot stop thinking about the rumors surrounding the supposedly delinquent prince who, after discovering that he was going to be disinherited, allegedly assembled a group of outlaws and massacred every noble who opposed his claim to the throne. According to the stories, his reign of terror continued when he constructed a savage arena for his followers and force them to eat toxic, rotting monster flesh as a twisted demonstration of absolute loyalty. The diplomat can only stare at him in wide-eyed terror, desperately trying to discern some hidden motive or objective behind the king's monstrous and notoriously unpredictable reputation. The king answers with a broad, predatory grin, his thoughts lingering on the steady stream of gambling profits and the promise of pure, uninhibited entertainment at someone else's expense. Gamaraz, the king's advisor, immediately erupts in outrage, insisting that the foreign kingdom's demand for 3,000 gold coins is completely unacceptable and should never even be entertained by the crown. Yet the king silences the entire chamber with a single calm declaration. His expression steady and stripped of its earlier menace, he announces that the empire will accept Katana's demands in full, with no further discussion. Everyone is left staring in stunned disbelief, mouths hanging open as they struggle to reconcile the terrifying stories surrounding their king with this sudden willingness to make such a diplomatic concession. A suffocating silence settles over the grand hall, leaving the entire court frozen beneath the weight of a decision so unexpected and impossible to understand. The king remains completely unmoved by his knight's objections, calmly explaining that preserving good relations with neighboring nations and ensuring the arena's continued prosperity are both critical. Aaron, however, is visibly distressed, his expression twisting as he pleads with his ruler to reconsider, fearing that such a concession will make their kingdom look weak before the world. Even as the knight insists that their own nation's actions caused the dispute in the first place, the king refuses to change his position, arguing that excessive rigidity during negotiations would only create further problems. With a sharp and focused look, he states that his decision is based on reasons of his own. Privately, however, he sees the diplomatic situation as an ideal excuse to take Lady Frau on a journey beyond the kingdom's borders. Turning next to military matters, he orders his forces to spend the entire month assisting Cadena with monster suppression, placing Captain Chrome of the Black Knights in charge of organizing the operation. The abrupt command leaves his subordinates stunned. He then turns toward Cadena's envoy and asks whether these conditions are acceptable. Completely unprepared for such unexpected generosity from the king, the diplomat can barely form a coherent answer. Overwhelmed by how dramatically the situation has changed, the envoy immediately accepts. Sweat covers his face as he repeatedly thanks the king for what he perceives as extraordinary generosity, terrified that even a moment of hesitation might cause the offer to disappear. As the diplomat's grateful praise fills the hall, Gamaraz steps forward with a carefully measured expression. Maintaining proper respect, he asks the king to explain the deeper reasoning behind committing so many resources to the effort. Noticing his advisor's suspicion, the king brings a hand to his chin and desperately searches for a convincing explanation that will conceal his far less serious desire to simply enjoy a trip abroad. Eventually, he warns them of a potentially catastrophic danger, a monster stampede in which an enormous number of creatures could suddenly surge across the region and cause widespread destruction. Although nobody yet knows exactly why monster activity in Cadena has increased, he argues that the possibility of such a disastrous swarm cannot be ignored. He finishes by describing the enormous losses Cadena could suffer if the monsters were pushed even further, an explanation Gamaraz finds perfectly reasonable. Inside, however, the king smiles to himself, relieved that his improvised story was accepted so easily, while eagerly looking forward to the entertainment ahead. He continues by presenting the expedition as an issue of Phelan's own national security, explaining that if a monster stampede erupted in Cadena, the consequences could eventually reach their borders as well. Chrome is deeply impressed by what he sees as extraordinary foresight and praises the wisdom of his ruler. Privately, the young king can only smirk at how surprisingly skilled he has become at inventing convincing excuses. This supposed display of wisdom immediately ignites Chrome's fighting spirit. He roars to his soldiers that monster suppression in Cadena is now the duty of the Black Knights and swears that they will complete the mission without failure. An entire month passes almost before they realize it. Once all preparations are complete, the king looks over his troops with mild bewilderment. Their motivation has grown far beyond anything he intended, their morale soaring at the thought of carrying out what they believe to be a noble and important mission. Yet despite all the military enthusiasm surrounding the expedition, the king remains focused on the personal side of the journey. Standing beside Frau, he eagerly looks forward to their first trip together, confidently assuming that the monster crisis must already have been resolved, and that the king of Cadena will now be ready to welcome them with open arms. What begins as a simple journey quickly takes on the scale of a major operation. A magnificent carriage travels across the countryside surrounded by a disciplined mounted escort, creating a display of military power that feels excessive for what is supposedly only a diplomatic visit to the capital city of Moss. Upon arrival, however, he is greeted by something entirely unexpected. Instead of the diplomatic delegation he had anticipated, the welcoming party is made up mostly of grim-faced officials and scholars. The atmosphere feels less like like the reception for a visiting monarch and more like the headquarters of a kingdom preparing for a desperate war. The reason for their grim expressions soon becomes horrifyingly obvious. On the horizon, the sky surrounding the distant castle is filled with dark silhouettes of flying monsters, while an enormous wave of beasts advances toward the stone walls. The threat he had originally invented as an excuse has somehow become a terrifying reality. The scale of the catastrophe is overwhelming. The cries of winged predators echo through the air as they circle the towers, while the ground shakes beneath the weight of the advancing horde. There can no longer be any doubt. The monster stampede has truly begun. From a distance, the vast horizon appears almost deceptively peaceful, hiding the nightmare steadily closing in on the kingdom. He stares at the capital of Kadena in complete disbelief, watching as the city is surrounded by an endless sea of monsters. His thoughts race as he tries to understand how such an enormous force could still exist when reports claimed that the Black Knights had already cleared the region of these threats. Memories of what happened 2 weeks earlier begin to return, casting the present disaster in an entirely different and far more disturbing light. It was during that period that what seemed like an almost supernatural act of foresight began taking shape among the Empire's forces. The captain remembers how skeptical he had initially been about the king's seemingly irrational orders. At first, the request involving Kadena had appeared foolish, but now, as every piece begins falling into place, what he sees as the terrifying brilliance behind the strategy becomes impossible to deny. Far inside the Demon Beast Forest, the foundations of the invasion had been carefully prepared. The monsters had not simply wandered toward the neighboring kingdom by chance. They had been deliberately and systematically driven forward so that they would strike its heart with maximum force. The captain studies a small vial, the key component in what he believes is a plan to bring Kadena completely under their control. By turning a monster stampede into a weapon, the true objective was supposedly never to prevent disaster, but to deliberately exploit one for total conquest. Standing beneath the shadows of the forest, the warrior feels a surge of dark pride. From his perspective, the operation has unfolded perfectly, proving once again the ruthless efficiency of the sovereign he serves. The substance inside the vial is revealed to be a powerful attractant produced in large quantities through secret research. Once scattered across Kadena's territory, it became an irresistible lure, drawing monsters from the forest toward the kingdom like moths toward a flame and ensuring that its defenses would eventually be overwhelmed. The final stage of this supposed plan was for the king and princess to arrive at the height of the destruction and present themselves as saviors. By rescuing the remaining towns and villages, they could establish a lasting foothold within Kadena while appearing to be liberators arriving only after the country had already been devastated. While the captain breaks into fanatical laughter and praises the flawless brilliance of a conquest he believes has only just begun, the young king stands in the present completely baffled. With growing horror, he realizes that his subordinates have misunderstood everything he said and somehow transformed his confusion into an elaborate villainous master plan. Despite the shocking revelation, his decision comes instantly and without hesitation. When the captain asks what they should do next, the young king firmly answers that they are going to help. The response leaves the armored commander completely confused, unable to understand why they would rescue the very people he believed they had come to conquer. With his decision made, the king steps forward and issues a booming order to his army, commanding them to wipe out every monster threatening the city. Behind him, the young princess watches silently, recognizing how he has reduced an impossibly complicated situation to one clear and heroic goal. His command hangs heavily over the battlefield as the true struggle for the kingdom's survival begins. A torrent of black flame erupts and reduces one monstrous creature to ash almost instantly. Watching the attack, the young princess is left stunned by the overwhelming destructive power of the dark fire. Smoke rises above the city of Moss as the true scale of the disaster becomes increasingly apparent. Even with the elite Black Knights deployed against the monsters, the invasion continues to intensify, threatening to consume the very center of the capital. In the middle of the chaos, George, captain of the local guard, approaches the young king and thanks him for arriving when he did. The ruler, however, is visibly tense, sweating as he wonders how he could possibly explain a catastrophe of this magnitude while also requesting an immediate audience with Kadena's monarch. George quickly destroys that hope by revealing that the king of Kadena fled the city with his royal guard the moment the monster horde appeared. The young ruler freezes in disbelief at such blatant cowardice, while far in the distance, the royal carriage can be seen safely retreating from the danger. A cold, calculating look enters his eyes as he considers the fact that Kadena's ruler abandoned his own citizens. He realizes that if he can personally eliminate the remaining monsters before the king returns, he may gain enough political leverage to soften whatever diplomatic consequences follow. Continuing the grim conversation with George, he learns that the monster outbreak has already spread to other cities throughout the kingdom. The captain speaks with growing concern, worried not only about the rising death toll, people, but also about the enormous reparations Kadena may be forced to pay if the destruction continues to expand. When the young king offers to resolve the entire crisis himself, George reacts with a mixture of disbelief and wounded national pride. He insists that Kadena cannot depend on Phelan for everything, desperately clinging to his country's dignity even while the city around him lies devastated. Frustrated by the captain's stubbornness, the king raises his voice and demands to know whether George is truly willing to let his people die merely to protect an empty sense of pride. Their argument is cut short by Captain Chrome's arrival, who reports that the immediate monster threat outside the castle has been completely eliminated. Looking across the battlefield, George is left speechless by the sheer efficiency of the foreign soldiers. The young king watches his reaction, privately thinking that his own warriors are exactly the kind of people who would exterminate an entire species without hesitation if doing so served their purpose. He remains detached as the Black Knights mobilize, their voices carrying through the stone corridors. Their loyalty to their sovereign is absolute as they prepare to purge Kadena of the invading monsters, loudly declaring their devotion to the crown. Meanwhile, the king of Kadena is left paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his nation's defenses. He cannot understand how his kingdom descended into such danger so quickly, particularly with the foreign king and his forces arriving in Moss. His thoughts return to the official complaint he had sent to Phelan, expecting assistance in destroying the monsters. Instead, he discovers that the Black Knights had been redirected into the Demon Beast Forest, causing him to suspect that the very allies he trusted may have deliberately betrayed him. That suspicion rapidly becomes raw terror as the palace turns into a scene of slaughter. He stumbles through blood-soaked corridors, his royal robes dragging through the blood of fallen guards while the screams of dying men echo through the halls. In the middle of the carnage, an imposing warrior steps into his path. Commander Chrome introduces himself with chilling courtesy, but his politeness offers little comfort. The terrified king immediately accuses the Black Knights of breaking their promise to protect his kingdom. Chrome remains completely calm and explains that by the time his forces arrived, the monster population had already been greatly reduced. This only confuses the king further, prompting him to demand why his territory is still being overrun if the creatures were supposedly brought under control. Chrome responds by explaining a grim fact of monster behavior. The smell of slain creatures naturally attracts even more dangerous predators. He dismisses the king's objections, arguing that incomplete extermination is actually worse than doing nothing, because leaving corpses behind simply draws stronger monsters toward an easy feast. He then admits, however, that there is another far more deliberate reason the crisis has continued. Reaching into his equipment, Chrome produces a small vial filled with a dark and powerful liquid. He explains that the substance is an alchemical attractant created specifically to lure monsters, becoming even more effective when mixed with the blood of dead creatures. His forces have been deliberately spreading it along the route toward Moss. The truth strikes the king with devastating force. He stares at Chrome in horror, finally understanding that the destruction consuming his country is not a natural disaster at all, but the result of a carefully orchestrated operation. The king shrinks back in fear as Chrome openly admits that he engineered the monster stampede, confirming the ruler's worst suspicions of betrayal. Trembling, the king listens as the commander coldly rejects his accusations, reminding him that inviting foreign troops across his borders was what truly opened the door to this disaster. Chrome tells the defeated ruler that his obligation to the crown has now been fulfilled, having exposed the truth that every foolish decision the king made was simply another piece of a much larger and darker design. The terrified monarch watches as Chrome produces another small vial and announces with grim certainty that it is finally time to bring their business to an end. Still cowering, the king listens as Chrome calmly explains that the alchemical substance inside this bottle does not even require monster blood to activate. Its effect is already complete, immediate, and absolute. The monarch begins desperately offering land and noble titles, stumbling over his words as he begs the commander to reconsider. Yet the man before him responds with nothing but cold, absolute indifference. His pleading ends abruptly when the commander surges forward and drives his blade deep into the king's abdomen with one merciless thrust. The mortally wounded ruler collapses to the ground while his executioner stands above him, remarking coldly that although the Knights of the Black Empire cannot be bought, the same clearly cannot be said for Kadena's own soldiers, who betrayed their sovereign for money. As the king's life begins slipping away, the smell of fresh blood spreads toward the surrounding forest, attracting predators that recognize the promise of a meal. Before long, monsters descend upon his remains, snarling as they tear apart the body of a ruler abandoned and betrayed by those who once served him. 3 days pass after the capital's fall. According to the official account, the king of Kadena had attempted to escape the collapsing city in a desperate effort to save himself, only to be torn apart by monsters. It was a convenient explanation for a ruler whose entire kingdom had fallen apart around him. Thanks to that version of events, the population instead celebrates their new protector. Jubilant crowds gather in the streets, shouting their gratitude and proclaiming him the savior of both Kadena and Moss. He moves through the cheering citizens with the young princess beside him, aware that although the monster threat has been eliminated and a degree of peace has returned, the political situation remains extremely fragile. The deception weighs heavily on him. He knows the true circumstances surrounding the king's death, and the undeniable reality that the monarch is permanently gone leaves him sweating coldly as he considers the seriousness of what must happen next. Looking across the enormous crowd, he realizes that simply returning to Phelan is no longer possible. Still, there is one grim advantage to the situation. With the previous regime eliminated, there is no remaining authority capable of challenging him. From the moment he arrived in Moss, he had acted quickly, sending his escort knights to eliminate the monsters still roaming the area while personally directing reconstruction efforts in the districts that had suffered the worst destruction. His intervention went beyond rebuilding. He began handing gold coins directly to impoverished survivors, earning increasingly devoted loyalty with every shining piece of currency. A faint, calculating smile crosses his face as he watches their reaction. He reasons that distributing treasury funds now could prevent future disputes regarding reparations, while simultaneously establishing a reputation for generosity that would benefit his long-term objectives. Once the first phase of relief work is complete, he finally reunites with the Black Knights stationed in Moss and discovers that morale among both the soldiers and the civilian population has reached unprecedented levels. Standing before his forces, he presents the final official account. The king of Kadena died during a horrifying monster attack, his body eventually discovered torn apart. The announcement sends shock through everyone present, solidifying the fabricated story as the only version of events the outside world will ever know. Surrounded by the consequences of his own deception, he listens as the nobles of Moss openly criticize their late ruler. To them, the king's supposed death at the hands of monsters represents a humiliating and pathetic end. Disillusioned with their former leadership, they begin shifting their allegiance toward the kingdom of Phelan. The young ruler can only sigh as the political situation becomes increasingly complicated, finding the sudden change in loyalties more troublesome than encouraging. The burden of his new position soon becomes almost physically tangible as crowds of ordinary citizens press around him. Their voices blend into a wave of gratitude as they thank him both for saving their lives and for distributing gold among them. Their overwhelming admiration feels suffocating, especially when contrasted with the cold calculations that brought him to this moment. Hoping for even a brief escape from the crowd, he is approached by Captain George. The veteran now addresses him with noticeably greater respect and asks for a private conversation concerning an urgent matter. George explains that Princess Rubus of Kadena remained inside the castle throughout the entire recent crisis. To the young king's surprise, she has formally requested an audience with the man believed to have saved her. He considers the request carefully, balancing the princess's apparent admiration against the obvious political implications. Although the thought of receiving praise from royalty strikes him as somewhat amusing, he ultimately agrees to meet her, curious about what the last surviving representative of Kadena's royal family truly wants from him. He agrees to the arrangement as the veteran soldier explains the princess's conditions in greater detail. She wants the dinner to be completely private and strictly confidential, with no one else present. Despite the unusual level of secrecy, he accepts without hesitation. Nearby, Frau observes the preparations with a quiet, knowing expression. She understands that no matter how private the princess intends the meeting to be, the mystical connection created by their contract will prevent anything said there from being truly hidden from her. Within the palace's silent halls, the collapse of Kadena's ruling dynasty hangs heavily over everything. With the king dead and public confidence in the royal family shattered, the future of the bloodline has become dangerously uncertain, leaving the princess almost entirely alone in a kingdom falling apart around her. She has effectively become a remnant of the old regime now that the transfer of power is nearly complete. By pouring gold into the devastated regions, the foreign king has successfully purchased the loyalty of the population. The people increasingly revere a ruler from another country, while the memory of their own monarch is buried beneath the humiliation of his disgraceful death. Every part of the crisis seems to have unfolded with almost unnatural perfection. Even the gold used to win over the population came from the reparations her father had previously demanded from Phelan. As she clenches her hand in silent thought, the sheer convenience of how neatly everything fits together leaves her deeply uneasy. Mars stands with a faint, knowing smile, appearing like the architect of a plan that has unfolded almost too perfectly. The reparations, Phelan's sudden willingness to cooperate, and the way Kadena's own demands were ultimately turned against it all seem arranged with suspicious precision. To an outside observer, it looks like an elaborate performance designed by the young king to manipulate the very foundations of the region. Beneath the image of a benevolent ruler, however, she suspects something far darker. In her mind, the monster stampede that devastated Cadena was no natural accident, but a disaster Mars deliberately engineered to create justification for invading the country. Watching from the shadows, she concludes that even if she exposed the truth publicly, the people, blinded by his strength and generosity, would refuse to believe her. As she watches him walk away with his cloak moving in the wind, she acknowledges how frighteningly effective he has been at capturing the loyalty of the population. To everyone else, he appears to be a brilliant strategist and an overwhelmingly powerful savior. To her, however, he is a predator concealed beneath the image of a hero. The shadows across his face seem to deepen, revealing the sinister quality that has already earned him whispered references as the Mad King. He appears to her as an extraordinarily dangerous man whose true intentions remain hidden behind the responsibilities of royalty, while his mind constantly produces schemes capable of consuming everything in his way. The possibility of his cruelty haunts her as she imagines what might happen if he succeeds in taking complete control of Cadena. In her mind, she sees burning buildings and hears the cries of her people, visions that serve as a grim warning of the future she believes he is creating. It leaves her convinced that she may be the only person who can truly recognize the monster hidden beneath the crown. She refuses to be deceived by the warm smile he presents to everyone else. As Cadena's princess, she believes the responsibility for protecting the kingdom now rests entirely upon her. For the sake of her nation and its people, she decides that she must intervene before his influence grows any further. Stepping fully into the light, Princess Rubis of Cadena reveals the true nature of her resolve. She does not intend merely to resist Mars. She plans to kill him in order to protect her kingdom. At just 14 years old, she prepares herself to confront the Mad King in a desperate attempt to halt his advance. Elsewhere in the palace, George and Princess Rubis quietly discuss the recent catastrophe. They conclude that the monster stampede was not accidental, but deliberately caused. At the same time, rumors that someone intends to assassinate King Mars have already begun spreading through the castle. Rubis stares ahead as her expression grows increasingly severe. The possibility that Mars plans to absorb Cadena into Phelan becomes impossible for her to ignore, revealing what she sees as a deliberate strategy to dismantle her kingdom completely. George emphasizes how desperate their situation has become, insisting that defeating King Mars is now the only way to preserve their country. With grim concern, he points out that southern Cadena has already effectively fallen under Phelan's influence, and that the population's loyalty is rapidly shifting toward the foreign ruler. He then admits the most troubling fact of all: nobody within Cadena possesses enough strength to challenge Mars directly. Rubis listens without speaking, the burden of responsibility pressing heavily upon her as she searches for some alternative to a battle they cannot possibly win. Memories of Mars's terrifying combat ability return to them. He and the warriors of the 100 destroyed monsters that entire armies had been unable to defeat. Their strength has become almost legendary, making them seem less like ordinary soldiers and more like an unstoppable force of nature. Direct resistance now appears to be nothing more than a hopeless endeavor. Faced with such overwhelming power, Rubis reaches a darker and far more desperate conclusion. Her eyes narrow with deadly resolve as she quietly suggests the only option she believes remains: poison. The proposal visibly unsettles George. Together, they begin developing the assassination plan, with George proposing a private dinner as the best opportunity to isolate the king. Rubis remains cautious, however, pointing out that Mars's wife, Lady Frau, is an exceptionally powerful magician who could easily detect magical interference or any obvious attempt to tamper with the meal. Standing together in the vast and empty corridor, Rubis turns toward her loyal captain and asks whether he will support her completely in what they are about to attempt. George stands rigidly at attention as the silence around them magnifies the seriousness of the decision they are about to make. Rubis decides that she alone will carry the full responsibility for the assassination, even if accomplishing it costs her life. By ensuring that all blame falls on her personally, she hopes to spare her people from indiscriminate retaliation and protect whatever remains of her kingdom. She prepares an extravagant banquet, filling the table with an impressive variety of exquisite dishes that draw gasps of admiration from everyone present. Among them sits a delicate pastry decorated with fresh berries, its flawless appearance concealing the deadly trap being prepared. Seated opposite her, King Mars sincerely thanks her for the generous hospitality, praising the distinctive flavors of Cadenian court cuisine and the warmth of the welcome he has received. As he enjoys the food, Rubis feels a brief pang of guilt, but quickly forces it aside. The fact that Mars has arrived completely alone and apparently unprotected is an opportunity far too valuable to waste. Beneath the pleasant aromas of the feast lies its true purpose. Every single dish has been poisoned with a lethal toxin, an intentionally excessive precaution meant to guarantee his death, even if he becomes suspicious and insists on exchanging plates. Rubis keeps her attention fixed on him, silently calculating how much of the contaminated food he must consume before the poison finally begins to take effect. In her imagination, she sees the unavoidable result. Mars collapsing onto the floor in unbearable agony, his body convulsing as his life drains away and blood spills from his mouth. She forces the disturbing image from her mind, only to notice him looking at her with a gentle expression, apparently finding her young and charming, while she struggles to control the growing anxiety of attempting an assassination for the first time. Eventually, Mars breaks the silence and steers the discussion toward the reason for their meeting, asking what matter had been important enough for her to request such an urgent conversation with him. Taking a steadying breath, Rubis brings up her grandfather, Duke Gordon of Northern Cadena. Mars immediately recognizes the subject as the beginning of what is likely to become an exhausting political negotiation. Sitting across from the princess with the table still covered in traditional Cadenian dishes, the young king casually comments on how impressive the feast looks, seemingly completely unaware of the murderous intent hidden behind the food. His relaxed behavior only makes Rubis more anxious, as the terrifying possibility occurs to her that he may already have detected the poison. She quickly hides her panic behind a strained smile and encourages him to keep eating, only for Mars to suddenly pause halfway through his sentence as though reconsidering the flavor. Then the young king unexpectedly breaks into a broad, genuine smile and enthusiastically declares that the intense spice and sharp bite of the food suit his tastes perfectly. He seems sincerely delighted, praising the meal with an excitement completely at odds with the lethal reality surrounding him. Rubis becomes increasingly unsettled as she watches him devour one poisoned dish after another with obvious enjoyment. She can only stare in stunned silence, unable to understand how any human being could consume such a massive quantity of toxin without displaying even the slightest discomfort. At the edge of the room, George and Frau exchange urgent whispers while observing the bizarre scene. They realize with growing alarm that the king's food truly has been poisoned, yet Mars continues eating as though nothing unusual is happening, forcing them to question what kind of man they are actually dealing with. As the banquet continues, Rubis becomes trapped by her own scheme. The antidote she prepared is far from perfect, and because she must continue eating alongside Mars to preserve the deception, the poison gradually begins affecting her as well. She watches him continue consuming the food with an almost inhuman appetite, increasingly horrified by the political disaster she may have created for herself. Breaking the tension, Mars suddenly shifts to a more personal subject and asks how old she is. Caught off guard, Rubis quietly admits that she is only 14, her defenses briefly lowered by the unexpected question. Mars immediately notices the coincidence, remarking with a sharp, thoughtful look that his younger brother is the same age. He explains that seeing her reminded him of the boy, while a sudden calculating intensity enters his eyes, suggesting that his thoughts have already moved far beyond the present conversation. Privately, he begins constructing a new idea. Perhaps responsibility for governing Cadena could be transferred to his younger brother, Nickel. Since Nickel and Rubis are the same age, Mars reasons that they may be able to manage the kingdom together, a possibility that brings a faint, dark smile to his face. Completely misreading the intention behind his questions, Rubis is overwhelmed by sudden shock as the possibility of a political marriage proposal enters her mind. She freezes in place, his words taking on a terrifying implication she had never considered. A chilling realization immediately follows. In her eyes, the king's proposal is a carefully calculated strategy to absorb her homeland without spilling a single drop of blood. By marrying her to his younger brother, he could effectively take control of Katana while preserving the appearance of legitimate succession. Horror washes over the princess as she considers how thoroughly everyone may have been manipulated. It feels as though they have all been nothing more than puppets moving within his grasp, every action anticipated in advance by his frightening intelligence. Mars continues speaking in a calm, almost casual manner, explaining that his brother Nickel has a sharp political mind and would make a suitable match. Despite the turmoil raging inside her, Rubis struggles to preserve her royal composure while searching for a way to refuse without provoking a diplomatic crisis. Before she can find an answer, the poison begins taking a visible toll on her body. Her thoughts grow increasingly clouded, her vision starts to blur, and she realizes with mounting dread that her strength is disappearing while the mental haze becomes too severe to think clearly. Desperate to leave and obtain an antidote, she forces an unnatural smile and promises to consider the proposal favorably. At this point, her only concern is ending the meeting before she completely loses consciousness. As Rubis hurriedly departs, Mars looks over the unfinished dishes with mild disappointment and comments on how much food is being wasted. The meeting ends without any further disturbance, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Word of the king's decision quickly reaches his advisor Gamaraz through magical communication. The veteran statesman is visibly shaken upon learning that Nickel is apparently being placed in charge of Cadena, a development he never could have anticipated. Gamaraz paces through the silent palace corridors, his thoughts racing as he tries to understand the true scale of Mars's ambitions. The implications of this new political arrangement weigh heavily on him as he considers what it could mean for the Empire's future. He realizes that if Nickel marries the princess and eventually takes Kadina's throne, the young prince will become a king in his own right. To Gamaraz, this suggests a degree of trust or strategic complexity in Mars's plans that he still cannot fully comprehend. His mind returns to the day Mars first became king, when many had assumed that Nickel, as his half-brother and a possible rival claimant, would eventually be executed. Instead, Mars has chosen to elevate him, leaving the elderly advisor increasingly fascinated by the true nature of the ruler he serves. Gamaraz continues marveling at what he interprets as the king's calculated mercy. Mars did not merely spare Nickel. He has now positioned him at the center of the very political scheme that was originally intended to destroy Mars himself. Nickel appears nothing like a condemned rival, instead displaying youthful confidence as he stands beside his mother. Both seem eager to carry out the role the king has prepared for them. Overwhelmed by what he sees as the brilliance of the maneuver, Gamaraz can no longer contain his emotions and openly begins to cry while praising Mars's extraordinary foresight. Outside the manor, a sudden urgent cry for the king breaks through the air, momentarily drawing attention away from the political schemes unfolding within the court. Inside, the atmosphere remains formal as Nickel and his mother express their sincere gratitude, thanking Mars for what they believe is an exceptionally generous and prestigious arrangement involving a favorable marriage match. As they prepare to leave the throne room, Nickel bows deeply. His voice carries a new sense of responsibility as he promises that he will not disappoint his older brother in the enormous task ahead. Despite how smoothly the meeting appears to have gone, Mars remains completely confused internally. He cannot understand why Nickel's mother is present or why everyone keeps discussing a marriage arrangement he has no memory of proposing. The conversation then turns toward the Princess of Kadina, with Nickel explaining that she is absent because she has fallen ill. Mars quietly decides that, regardless of all the confusion, his half-brother at least seems properly motivated. Wanting to ensure that the plan proceeds safely, Captain Chrome steps forward and offers to personally escort the young prince during his journey to the castle. The king accepts the offer and formally places the mission in the hands of his trusted captain, who receives the order with fierce and unwavering determination. Moments later, a scream of agony echoes through the castle, marking the beginning of their violent intervention. The veteran warrior stands amid the bloodshed with his sword drawn and stained red, warning anyone still willing to resist not to block the path of Kadina's future king. Behind him, Nickel remains remarkably relaxed, almost playful in his demeanor. Addressing Captain George, he suggests that the veteran knight simply allow him to meet his future bride without causing any further trouble, while George desperately calls for an end to the pointless violence. The young noble continues, explaining that the marriage was arranged by the king himself through an agreement forged between the grandfathers of both families. With a smile, he adds that both sides welcomed the arrangement and even expressed their gratitude to King Mars. The revelation leaves George stunned. He insists that Duke Gordon would never consent to such a marriage involving his granddaughter and declares the entire idea absurd. Noticing the knight's continued resistance, Nickel leans closer and asks whether George truly wants the princess's previous actions against King Mars to be dragged into the open. He dismisses the knight's confusion as complete foolishness, explaining that people throughout the realm are constantly plotting to kill his brother, a reality George seems unable to fully understand. A dark, knowing smile then appears on Nickel's face as he declares with chilling confidence that a true sovereign stands beyond the reach of ordinary men and their insignificant schemes. He gives George one final, cold choice. The knight may continue his feudal resistance or simply move aside, and Nickel makes it clear that either outcome is equally acceptable to him. Faced with this ultimatum, George finally gives in. Lowering his head in defeat, he admits that there is nothing more he can do, while Nickel offers him a hollow word of reassurance. George steps aside, allowing the meeting to continue. Rubis, still visibly guarded, suggests that they move to her private chambers where they can speak without interruption. Nickel keeps his cheerful expression and readily accepts. Once inside the ornate privacy of her room, Rubis wastes no time with formalities and immediately demands to know what he truly wants from her and from Kadina. He answers with an apparently benevolent explanation, claiming that their only goal is to cooperate in building a better Kadina for everyone. Rubis remains deeply skeptical, insisting that Kadina was already a prosperous nation long before Phelan's intervention. Nickel responds with a pointed observation. If the country had truly been governed so successfully, its people would never have transferred their loyalty to his brother so easily. Beyond the chamber, the silent towers of the castle stand as symbols of the changing balance of power. The underlying reality is difficult to deny. A genuinely stable nation would never have left such an opening for a foreign power to intervene so decisively. Nickel continues defending his position, arguing that no other ruler cares as sincerely for ordinary people as his brother brother does. When Rubis challenges him by asking what purpose a nation is supposed to serve, he answers immediately. A country exists entirely for the sake of its people. His response only enrages her further. Slamming her hands down, she rejects his words as nothing more than lies and reminds him of the horrifying reputation surrounding Phelan's Mad King, a ruler whose rise is said to have been paved with the blood of countless victims. The stories surrounding Mars are indeed brutal, describing a path to power built through banditry and the systematic slaughter of the nobility. Some rumors even claim that he consumes monster flesh and takes pleasure in the bloodshed of his private arena. Rubis leans forward, indignation blazing in her eyes as she asks whether someone like that can truly be called a decent human being. Nickel can only respond with an awkward, somewhat embarrassed smile, unable to completely deny the darker elements of his brother's personality. Even so, his expression softens as he points out one important detail that the rumors usually ignore. No matter how much violence has surrounded Mars's reign, his brother has never once raised his blade against innocent people or ordinary civilians. He explains that the king's violence was never indiscriminate. Mars specifically eliminated corrupt nobles who had abandoned their responsibilities and personally hunted down the monsters terrorizing the countryside. That is why he commands such overwhelming public support in Phelan, and the same sentiment is now beginning to spread throughout Kadena itself. He goes on to explain that removing Phelan's nobility also eliminated the corrupt intermediaries who had been siphoning money from taxation. Without them, state revenue increased dramatically while the financial burden placed on ordinary citizens became significantly lighter. Even after hearing his reasoning, she struggles to accept it, lowering her gaze in thought. To her, it seems impossible that an entire country could truly feel no resentment toward a ruler whose reputation is so deeply associated with bloodshed. Recognizing her uncertainty, he warmly invites her to visit Phelan and see the reality for herself. The proposal leaves her shaken as everything she once believed about the Mad King begins to collapse in an instant. She looks up in surprise when he adds something more personal, admitting that beyond all the political considerations, he is genuinely pleased with how things have turned out. Leaning slightly closer with a gentle smile, he tells her that his future bride is both intelligent and adorable. The unexpected compliment catches her completely unprepared, leaving her wide-eyed and unable to respond. Not long after that conversation, the two are married in a magnificent ceremony. Their union represents far more than a simple marriage, officially marking Kadena's incorporation into the kingdom of Phelan and establishing a new era of peace between the two nations. Standing together as husband and wife, Nickel sincerely expresses his hope that they can build a prosperous future while maintaining good relations with the people of Kadena. Rubis remains beside him, although a lingering trace of uncertainty still remains in her thoughts as the sun descends over the castle. Their sudden marriage leaves many wondering what kind of relationship truly exists between them. Some regard it as a brilliant political maneuver, while others simply wonder how such an unlikely couple ended up together under the influence of an apparently clueless Cupid. King Dorson of Porsan looks upon what remains of Kadena's former royal family with open contempt, considering them utterly incompetent. His thoughts instead turn toward the young ruler now occupying Phelan's throne, the man known as the Mad King Mars. Since that youth seized power, Phelan has transformed into something almost unrecognizable and considerably more dangerous. With the regional balance of power shifting so dramatically, the ambitions of the neighboring kingdom can no longer be ignored. Porsan had watched Phelan exploit the chaos of a monster stampede to absorb Kadena almost overnight, an action that seemed to clearly demonstrate a willingness to expand its influence by any means necessary. Sitting upon his own throne, Dorson narrows his eyes as he considers the growing threat. In his view, Mars is nothing more than an arrogant young upstart who has become far too bold, strengthening Dorson's determination to intervene. Before him kneel the displaced prince and princess of Kadena, pleading for his assistance in reclaiming their homeland. Outwardly, Dorson declares that he cannot simply ignore Phelan's blatant aggression. Privately, however, he mocks their desperation, regarding them as naive fools for believing his support will come without a cost. His strategy is calculated and ruthless. First, he will issue a formal diplomatic demand that Kadena's throne be returned to its former crown prince. If Phelan agrees peacefully, the matter will be simple. If it refuses, he is already prepared for war. Once Kadena is recovered, Dorson intends to reduce the young royals to little more than puppet rulers, using them as his eyes and ears on the ground. He believes the coming confrontation will finally bring the conflict to an end, but the victory he seeks has nothing to do with justice or restoring the rightful monarchy. His true objective is to increase his own power through sacrifices made by others. He has little concern for what ultimately happens to Kadena or its population. What matters to him is remaining the unseen authority behind the throne, allowing the legitimate heirs to carry the responsibilities of government and suffer the consequences of failure while he controls them from the shadows. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the young king of Phelan receives the official ultimatum and reads through it with a mixture of surprise and growing understanding. The demand is straightforward. Kadina's throne must be returned to its former crown prince. As he absorbs the message, he notices another, more personal letter from Nickel and realizes that the situation is far more complicated than an ordinary dispute over territory. He puts the documents aside as his expression hardens with grim resolve. Understanding that war with King Dorson has now become unavoidable, he immediately orders Phelan's most powerful forces to mobilize in preparation for the approaching conflict. His thoughts turn toward Kadina, a kingdom that had never truly belonged to Phelan in the first place. He then thinks of Nickel, the supposedly scholarly young man who defied expectations by marrying the princess and ascending to the throne. The astonishing speed of the marriage, only 2 weeks, still leaves Mars confused, but the political reality is unmistakable. King Dorson has now positioned himself as Phelan's direct enemy. The approaching conflict immediately ignites Aaron's fighting spirit. He rallies the surrounding soldiers with a thunderous call for war, promising to crush anyone foolish enough to stand in their path. While the young king is clearly unsettled by how rapidly the situation is escalating, Gamaraz remains disturbingly composed. He proposes that they seize the initiative and invade Kadina before Dorson has time to strengthen his position. The advisor continues calculating with ruthless efficiency, pointing out that the coming war would also provide the perfect opportunity to debut their newly created monster army, leaving the king struggling to keep up with the sheer aggression of his plans. Trying to drag the discussion back toward reason, the king argues for restraint and diplomacy, warning them about the consequences of recklessly charging into war. His objections are quickly drowned out, however, as Gamaraz turns to the assembled elite warriors and explains the situation plainly. Dorson has demanded that Kadina be surrendered. The news hits Aaron with tremendous force. Furious, he declares that he will never stand aside while foreign opportunists attempt to steal territory from them. Burning with outrage, the warrior turns toward the soldiers and demands that they make the enemy pay in blood, crushing the thieves who dared threaten their borders. Watching his soldiers become increasingly excited for battle, the king is forced to acknowledge an unpleasant reality. Dorson's army is a serious and well-equipped military threat that cannot simply be dismissed. Aaron explains just how severe the coming battle may be, estimating that the enemy will outnumber them by roughly 5 to 1. Yet even such overwhelming odds fail to concern him, and he speaks of the disadvantage as though it were nothing more than another tactical problem to solve. Noticing the young king's hesitation, the armored warrior grins confidently and raises 5 fingers. The solution, he says, is simple. Each of them only needs to kill 5 enemies to eliminate the numerical disadvantage. The brutal simplicity of the calculation leaves the king visibly disturbed by how casually his men speak about slaughter. Their bloodlust rapidly spreads throughout the ranks, with soldiers roaring in excitement and promising to bring the severed heads of their enemies back as offerings to their ruler. Mars recoils internally at the gruesome tribute they seem so eager to deliver, realizing that he has completely lost control over their sense of morality. The soldiers grow even louder as they begin competing over who can promise the largest number of trophies. Some shout that they will bring 10 heads, while others boast of 20 or even 30. Their expressions are filled with disturbing anticipation for the violence ahead, driven by a shared hunger for glory and revenge that Aaron enthusiastically encourages with booming laughter. Looking at the madness spreading before him, the king feels as though the value of human life is disappearing entirely. He wonders how he is supposed to govern a country that measures victory by the number of corpses it can pile up, his conscience buckling beneath the horrifying expectations of his own people. Desperate to find some remaining trace of restraint, he turns to Gamaraz and hopes that ordinary citizens might still prefer peace. The advisor immediately destroys that hope, calmly informing him that the population is fully committed to war and expects their ruler to. The same attitude echoes through the city, where the people demand an opportunity to demonstrate their nation's strength to the continent and punish what they see as King Dorson's arrogance. Calls for vengeance merge into one enormous cry, filling the air with the promise of bloodshed and leaving virtually no room for opposition. Realizing that the momentum of his kingdom has become impossible to stop, the young monarch closes his eyes and accepts the trap he has created for himself. The war council is already in motion, and the escape he hoped to find has been closed off by the very citizens he promised to protect, leaving him only one inevitable course. With Gamaraz and the other officials surrounding him and reporting that both the monster army and the soldiers are fully prepared, the king finally gives in. His face hardens with grim resignation as he speaks the words that will alter history, formally declaring that they will go to war. Outside the palace, the world remains completely indifferent to the decision. Trees stand quietly beneath the fading evening light, their peaceful silhouettes sharply contrasting with the violent storm forming behind the palace walls. The calm air gives no indication of the chaos that has just been released into the world. The king soon approaches an isolated facility facility hidden deep within the forest, the site of one of the kingdom's most controversial experiments. Accompanied by his advisor, he arrives to inspect the monster mass production program, an initiative he had largely ignored until the approaching war made it impossible to overlook. There, they are greeted by the project's chief researcher, a mage recruited specifically to oversee the operation. She introduces herself as Keely, a monster research specialist working under Lady Fraw's command. The king studies her carefully, recognizing her obvious intelligence while questioning why someone from the magical nation of Kiel would choose to come all the way to Fulon. Keely explains that although Kiel is renowned as a land of magic, its rigid limitations prevented her from pursuing her ambitions freely. Her voice rises with indignation as she recalls how her superiors expelled her over what she considers a single unfortunate incident involving a monster going berserk and causing several casualties. In her view, they completely failed to appreciate the brilliance of her research. Listening to her, the king grows increasingly uneasy and privately concludes that this woman is potentially extremely dangerous, with enthusiasm that clearly overwhelms any sense of caution. Even so, he asks for a progress report on the monster army. Keely responds with almost manic excitement, declaring that the dream she has pursued throughout her entire life is finally coming true. She enthusiastically expresses her gratitude toward Fulon for granting her the freedom to ignore the restrictive laws that had previously prevented her research from advancing. Keely praises him as a visionary monarch capable of understanding the value of monsters both as weapons and as entertainment. Internally, however, he decides that she will need to be monitored far more closely than she seems to expect. She then explains that his reputation has already spread throughout the magical world, though not in the way he imagined. While he thinks of himself as a villain who seized the throne outside the law and violently crushed dissent, mages regard him as almost legendary precisely because of his complete lack of restraint. Keely continues, explaining that his willingness to permit human experimentation in pursuit of magical advancement has fundamentally changed everything, transforming his kingdom into a destination for researchers who had previously been rejected. Her eyes widen with increasingly manic enthusiasm as she describes Fulon as a sanctuary where the advancement of magic is valued above human life itself. With a triumphant gesture, she declares that to brilliant but exiled researchers like herself, the kingdom is nothing less than paradise. The king is visibly disturbed by this revelation and asks why so many unethical researchers would be drawn to his country. Keely casually redirects the matter toward the princess, pointing out that she is actually the one conducting the human experiments. Moving on to the practical results of their research, Keely describes their success with monster breeding. In particular, they managed to restore the nearly extinct killer rabbit population, expanding it from just 100 creatures into a thriving colony. Interested in the military potential of everything she has described, the king asks to see the legendary monster army for himself. Keely responds by pointing toward an enormous structure nearby. When they reach the enclosure, they are confronted by a colossal snarling beast staring at them with predatory intensity from behind reinforced bars. The king can only look on in amazement. Keely explains that the creatures are fed exclusively on monster flesh and grew to this extraordinary size extremely quickly because they were given high-grade remains recovered after the recent stampede. Altogether, this process produced 10 enormous specimens. When the king questions whether 10 creatures could possibly be enough for a full-scale war, Keely explains that these monsters are merely the central unit. Many more are currently roaming throughout the demon beast forest, all strengthened by specialized potions she developed. She goes on to explain that the war wolf population is reproducing without restriction, while their alpha continues aggressively expanding its territory every single day. Despite the animals' extreme ferocity, Keely admits that she finds them strangely charming. The explanation leaves the young king thoroughly confused until Keely clarifies that the alpha wolf refuses to recognize anyone except him as its master and responds only to the name King Zero. He struggles to understand why a creature like that would willingly submit to him, prompting Keely to ask whether he truly does not remember their first encounter. The memory returns from a year earlier when he had brought one of the beasts back with him. At the time, the creature had been utterly terrified, visibly scarred and trembling uncontrollably at the mere sight of him. Because of that overwhelming display of dominance, Keely concludes that the beast must now regard him as the ultimate apex predator. Still, she cannot resist asking whether he had nearly beaten it to death in order to earn such absolute submission, a possibility he quietly admits may be true. Once that hierarchy had been established, domestication became surprisingly simple. The wolves now obey any order given in the king's name without hesitation. The brutal process has produced an exceptionally powerful military asset, with more than 1,300 beasts now fully under their control and prepared for the approaching war. Looking out across the banners of his kingdom, the young ruler reflects on the enormous responsibility of leading Phelan into its first full-scale conflict. Although a lingering Seeing unease remains, he is confident that they are ready to confront King Dorson's advancing forces.